Hey guys, tonight we slip beneath the brocade and into the incense-heavy vaults of medieval Christendom. You're standing in the dim glow of flickering tallow candles, their smoke curling around the polished toes of papal statues. Gold-leafed frescoes shimmer on cold marble walls, and outside the heavy doors, Rome snores its ancient lullaby. But inside these hallowed chambers, the air hums not with holiness, but with rumor, intrigue, and scandal. Not every man who wore the papal tiara was a paragon of virtue. Some were frankly better suited for a tavern brawl than a benediction. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to post your location and local time in the comments. Let's see where and when in the world we're all falling asleep tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval papacy is often portrayed as a beacon of divine guidance. But let's be honest, sometimes it resembled a medieval soap opera written by monks with a flair for drama. You stroll past tapestries bearing the serene faces of saints, yet the whispers you hear echo tales of bribes, vendettas, and whispered trysts. The grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica cloaks a power structure that at times would have made Machiavelli blush. You find yourself at the gates of the Lateran Palace, its columns cracked by time, but its legacy untouched by modesty. Inside, popes orchestrated wars, crowned emperors, and occasionally invited their favorite concubines to dinner. Historians still argue whether the worst of these accounts are exaggerated or simply underreported. You might think of the papacy as a divine line of succession, but tonight you'll discover it was often a roulette wheel, spun by noble families, armies, and coin purses. Back then, the road to sainthood might have involved a little selective memory. And yet, even amidst the sins and schemes the papacy endured, perhaps it's the contrast the sacred housed within the scandalous that makes these stories so oddly soothing. Like sneaking into the back room of a cathedral, only to find a secret poker game in progress with saints painted above and coins clinking below. We'll start with one of the strangest legends to cling to Vatican walls, the curious case of a pope who may not have been a man at all. You've heard of secret tunnels and hidden relics, but what about a pregnancy scandal? In the middle of a papal parade, a woman, in the highest office of the Christian world, draped in holy robes, blessing the masses, guiding the faithful, and giving birth in the street. Tonight, you tiptoe toward one of the strangest rumors ever whispered through cathedral walls. The story of Pope Joan is the Church's most persistent scandal that might have been. Officially, the Vatican says she never existed. Unofficially, her name has lingered for centuries, etched in marginalia, murmured in sermons, and repeated by tavern bards who swear they know a guy whose grandfather saw the statue. You're standing now near what used to be called the Via Sacra in Rome, a ceremonial route where the Pope's grand procession once passed, a place where legend says it all unraveled literally. It starts in the 9th century, or maybe the 11th, or possibly even the 13th. No one can quite agree. That's your first clue that you're stepping into the hazy realm of medieval fact, where history and rumor are roommates who never label their food. Historians still argue whether Pope Joan was a real figure hidden from the records or an allegory gone rogue. Either way, she remains unforgettable. According to the most popular version of the tale, Joan was a bright girl born in Mainz, Germany. She dressed as a boy to gain access to forbidden education, journeyed through monasteries, and eventually impressed so many scholars that she ended up in Rome under the name John Anglicus. She climbed the clerical ladder not by noble birth, nor bribes, but by raw intellect and charm. You lean closer as the story darkens. She eventually became pope, supposedly reigning for 2 years before fate caught up with her. The tale climaxes during a procession from St. Peter's to the Lateran. Crowds cheer, incense clouds the air, and suddenly the Pope doubles over in pain. To gasps and horror, he gives birth in the middle of the street. The child dies. Joan is either stoned by the crowd or banished to a convent, depending on which manuscript you believe. You can almost hear the clatter of hooves and panicked murmurs as the truth unraveled in real time. The site of her disgrace, they say, was scrubbed from processional routes forever. The Church's own embarrassment supposedly led to the introduction of the sedia stercoraria, a pierced chair on which future popes would sit so that cardinals could discreetly check, shall we say, what nature provided. But was any of this true? That's the fun part. There are no papal records from the time with a Joan, yet her name crops up repeatedly in later chronicles and even Protestant polemics. Statues thought to resemble her have mysteriously disappeared. In some versions, a small street shrine marked the spot where she gave birth, later bulldozed. Even Dante didn't touch the tale. And if Dante didn't put you in hell, maybe you didn't exist, or maybe you were too taboo to mention. The idea of a female pope was scandalous, not just because of gender, but because of the layers it implied: deception, sexuality, human frailty, disguised in papal finery. Still, there's something irresistibly human in the legend. A brilliant woman trapped in a world where knowledge was gatekept by cassocks and scrolls. You picture her, perhaps a teenager, hunched over a candle in a scriptorium translating Greek while keeping her voice low. If she lived, she must have lived in terror of discovery. If she didn't, then someone created a story so powerful it haunted the Church for centuries. Whichever version you prefer, one thing is certain: the Church responded not with outrage, but silence, deafening silence, as if hoping that by not acknowledging the tale, it would wither. But as you know, legends fed by shadows tend to grow taller. And so, Pope Joan remains a ghost in Rome's holy corridors, a whisper carried by wind through colonnades, a statue missing from the gallery, and maybe a smirk from history herself hiding behind stained glass, ready for something even more outrageous. Next, we enter the palace of Pope John XV, a man whose resume includes simony seduction and possibly getting beaten to death by the husband of one of his lovers. You'll want to wash your hands after this one. If someone handed you the keys to the Vatican and you threw a week-long frat party, you'd still be more restrained than the man you're about to meet. So what happens when a teenage pope trades the Bible for bacchanals, turns basilicas into brothels, and breaks nearly every commandment before breakfast? You're about to find out. Enter Pope John XII, elected at just 18 years old in the year 955. If that sounds like a recipe for disaster, you'd be absolutely correct. You stand now in the echoing marble atrium of the Lateran Palace, but close your eyes, and suddenly the air smells of spiced wine, overripe fruit, and something far less holy. This was no temple of solemn prayer. It was a stage for decadence. Historians still argue whether the stories are exaggerated, crafted by political enemies eager to defame a rival pope. But even the tamest accounts of John's papacy read like a medieval tabloid. He allegedly hosted gambling sessions on altars, invoked pagan gods during ceremonies, and turned the papal palace into what one chronicler called a house of ill fame. Another whispered that he did nothing that was right, which is putting it diplomatically. You walk past gold-inlaid tiles, worn down not by prayerful pilgrims, but by courtesan slippers and dice tossed on marble. Picture John lounging in silken robes, wine cup in one hand, the other trailing lazily over a guest's shoulder. This wasn't the robe and mitre kind of pope. This was the party on Sunday, sin on Monday model. And Tuesday through Saturday weren't exactly devoted to repentance either. He was rumored to have toasted Satan's health during banquets, possibly a smear tactic, possibly real. You tilt your head at that line between fact and fiction, where medieval chroniclers didn't hesitate to write salacious accusations in the margins of official records. Still, so many chroniclers across regions reported the same patterns, it's hard to wave them all away. John's political moves didn't fare much better. He played dangerous power games with the Holy Roman Emperor, Otto swearing allegiance one moment, betraying him the next. In 963, Otto convened a synod and accused John of simony perjury murder, and notably turning the Vatican into a gambling hall. Even the bishops, no strangers to scheming themselves, seemed stunned. And yet, John refused to show up. He scoffed at the charges and fled. Eventually, he regained power for a brief, messy encore. But that ended, according to some accounts, when he was caught in bed with a married woman. Her husband, less than amused, beat the Pope to death. That's right. The Vicar of Christ allegedly smacked into eternity over a domestic dispute. Now let's pause. You may wonder, how does someone like this become Pope? The answer lies in medieval politics. The papacy wasn't a merit-based system. It was a cocktail of bloodline bribes and brute force. John the Fiend was from the powerful Tusculani family, a dynasty that treated Rome like its playground. If you were born with the right name, virtue was optional. And yet somehow the church kept going. The stained glass still shone. The chants still rose at Vespers. Perhaps people compartmentalized. Perhaps they believed the office was holy, even if the man in it wasn't. Or perhaps they just didn't have many options. As you wander through the ghost of John's Rome, you marvel at the contrasts. A city where a pope could lead mass in the morning, then host a masked orgy by moonlight. Where the boundaries between sacred and profane blurred until no one could quite tell which was which. The marble remembers, even if the records pretend to forget. The lesson. Not all popes were paragons. Some were cautionary tales carved into Vatican stone. And John the Fünfth. He might be the original what not to do manual in human form. But if you think that was dark, wait until you hear about the Pope who was literally put on trial after death. Let me ask you this. What kind of courtroom drama features a rotting corpse, a throne, and a very angry group of bishops? Because yes, someone once dug up a dead pope, dressed him in full regalia, and put him on trial. No, this isn't a twisted parable or Renaissance fan fiction. It's an actual moment in papal history, so surreal you'll swear it came from a fever dream. This is the Cadaver Synod. The year is 897, and you're standing in the Basilica of St. John Lateran. The air is heavy with the scent of mildew and old incense. Morning light cuts through the dust as a grim audience gathers. Bishops line the benches, fidgeting with their robes, trying not to gag. Because in the center of this grotesque legal theater sits Pope Formosus dead, for 9 months propped up on a throne, his skeletal remains cradled in silk. The trial was orchestrated by Pope Stephen VI, Formosus's successor and fierce political rival. Historians still argue whether this was revenge a power play or a complete mental breakdown. Whatever the motive Stephen had, the exhumed corpse clothed in papal garments and brought into court. A deacon was assigned to speak on Formosus's behalf, voicing answers for the corpse while Stephen screamed accusations. You shift uncomfortably. So did everyone else. The charges violating canon law by accepting the papacy while already serving as bishop of another see. That's the official reason. The unofficial reason, politics. Formosus had aligned with the wrong side during Rome's endless power struggles, and Stephen wanted to make an example of him, even if it meant talking to a skeleton. The audience watched in stunned silence as Stephen ranted, foamed, and gestured wildly at the moldering figure. The deacon, reportedly pale as Wax tried to mouth back responses, turning the whole affair into a grotesque puppet show of justice. You imagine the waxy fingers of the corpse drooping over the throne, the bones rustling inside their decayed vestments. One bishop probably fainted. You wouldn't blame him. Eventually, the court declared the dead pope guilty. His papacy was invalidated. His robes were torn off the fingers he once used to give blessings were sliced off. And his body, yes, still wearing the papal tiara, was dragged through the streets of Rome and tossed into the Tiber River. Though rumor claims his body washed ashore and began performing miracles, because of course it did. Stephen VI's own fate. Less than a year later, he was deposed, imprisoned, and strangled in his cell, perhaps by divine irony, or perhaps just one of Rome's many angry factions repaying madness with madness. The Synod of the Corpse was never repeated, but its echo haunted the Vatican for centuries. You run a hand along the cool marble pillar beside you, imagining how many secrets it's overheard. There's something eerie about the way power in Rome seemed to follow no rules, at least none of the divine kind. Alive or dead, the Pope could be judged, humiliated, weaponized. And yet the Church carried on. So why does the Cadaver Synod still fascinate? Maybe because it shatters the image of timeless serenity we associate with the Vatican. Maybe because it shows how fragile institutions become when rage and superstition take the wheel. Or maybe because it's just that bizarre. But believe it or not, there's a pope who managed to be worse while still breathing. Next up, a man who sold the papacy like you'd sell a second-hand mule twice. Have you ever returned something you sold, then sold it again, then tried to buy it back? Now imagine doing that with the papacy. Yes, that papacy. The throne of St. Peter sold like a plot of land or a particularly aggressive goat. Welcome to the wild career of Pope Benedict the Mine. The medieval church had no refund policy for popes, but Benedict somehow treated the office like a family heirloom passed around at awkward reunions. You step into the shadows of the 11th century Lateran courtyard, where whispers of scandal cling to the stone like damp moss. The air is thick with incense, but there's also a scent of coin because nothing about Benedict's reign was wholly for free. He became pope not once, not twice, but 3 times. Historians still argue whether that makes him especially devout, especially corrupt, or just indecisive. Born into the powerful Tusculan dynasty, yes, the same clan that gave us party Pope John the Thean, Benedict was allegedly made pope around the age of 20, though some claim even younger. And surprise, he didn't exactly win by popular vote. Family influence and heavy bribes helped ease him into the white robes. You picture him lounging with a cup of wine, toying with the idea of being the spiritual leader of Christendom in between hunting trips and awkward family feuds. Reports suggest he lived scandalously, hosting wild banquets and engaging in behavior unbecoming of, well, anyone outside a particularly raucous noble court. After one term of chaotic rule, he was forced out by political opponents. But wait, he came back and then left again, this time willingly, to pursue marriage. Yes, Benedict allegedly stepped down so he could wed, prompting one chronicler to comment that he seemed to treat the papacy as a boy might a toy. And here's the kicker. When he resigned in 1045, he sold the papacy to his godfather, who became Pope Gregory VI. That's not a metaphor. It was a literal transaction. Coins changed hands, titles exchanged, and suddenly we had a Pope for cash deal so scandalous that even other corrupt clergy went wide-eyed. Soon after, yet another contender, Pope Sylvester III, tried claiming the throne. The result, a three-way papal tug-of-war. It was like medieval theological musical chairs, but with crowns instead of cushions. You couldn't keep up without a scorecard and probably a stiff drink. Eventually, Emperor Henry III stepped in and called the Council of Sutri, where all three popes were ousted. It took imperial muscle to finally bring Benedict's back-and-forth saga to an end, though not without rumors that he tried to claim the tiara one more time. You can practically hear the collective groan of exhausted bishops. And yet even this absurd chapter reveals something deeper. The papacy, far from being a sacred lighthouse in the storm of medieval life, was often a prize in a brutal, messy power game. Family factions, royal houses, military, might they all saw the throne of St. Peter as a pawn, not a pulpit. You trail your fingers along the rim of a weathered baptismal font, wondering how many faithful believers prayed under Benedict's reigns, unaware or perhaps unconcerned by the chaos at the top. To them God was constant, but the men in his name less so. What happened to Benedict and mine? In the end, he disappears into the fog of time like a gambler who overstayed his welcome. Some say he died in a monastery. Others think he simply vanished, scandal trailing behind him like a ripped cloak. And while the papal halls echoed with power and sin just beyond the city walls, another world waited. Some say he died in a monastery. Others think he simply vanished, scandal trailing behind him like a ripped cloak. And while the papal halls echoed with power and sin just beyond the city walls, another world waited, quiet, structured, and strangely peaceful. A world where ink flowed slower, voices lowered, and the divine was found not in gold and scandal, but in silence and simplicity. Let's slip through a different kind of gate now. But scandal, as you've noticed, has a way of lingering. Speaking of which, you're about to attend the most infamous dinner party in Vatican history. There will be dancing poisoning and a family name that still sends shivers, Borgia. Tonight's menu includes roast peacock poisoned wine and a dance card filled with danger. But the real question, how do you throw a Vatican orgy that still horrifies historians 500 years later? If you guessed, have your last name be Borgia, you're already halfway there. Welcome to the decadent world of Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, the poster child for papal scandal and Renaissance excess. You step through the gilded corridors of the Apostolic Palace and almost expect to be handed a mask, a goblet, and a dagger. This wasn't just a pope. It was a man who dined with devils, danced with daughters, and allegedly poisoned rivals between courses. Historians still argue which tales are slander and which are simply too outrageous not to be true. But Alexander's reputation didn't need exaggeration. He secured the papacy through a dizzying symphony of bribes, favors, and carefully cultivated enemies. Once in power, he installed relatives in plush cardinal seats, like Christmas ornaments, His son Cesare was a cardinal at 18, and his daughter Lucrezia. Well, we'll get to her. Tonight, though, your candlelight casts its glow on a single legendary event, the Banquet of Chestnuts. Picture this. It's October 1501. You walk into the Pope's private apartments and find a lavish banquet laid out not for nobles, but for 50 courtesans. After dinner, the silverware disappears and the tables are cleared for something else entirely. The chestnuts scattered on the floor, reportedly as obstacles in a bizarre licentious game. As one chronicler put it, the courtesans crawled about, picking them up, while the Pope watched with glee. You probably weren't expecting papal voyeurism on the agenda. But here we are. The chronicler in question, Johann Burchard, was Alexander's own master of ceremonies. While some believe he exaggerated his journal, remains the most detailed and damning account of Vatican debauchery. It includes lines about prizes being handed out to the most vigorous performers, let's say, and names Alexander's son, Cesare, and daughter Lucrezia as attendees. Though whether they participated or merely observed remains part of the eternal scholarly shrug. You shift uncomfortably. It's not just the party, it's what it symbolized. Under Alexander VI, the Vatican wasn't a bastion of piety. It was a court of glittering sin. Cesare, dressed in cardinal robes, was busy orchestrating military campaigns and allegedly sleeping with his sister. Lucrezia, used as a marital pawn, became both a symbol of Renaissance beauty and political tragedy. The Borgia crest bull's rampant tongues lolling might as well have been a warning sign. By the time Alexander died in 1503, possibly poisoned by mistake or design, Rome breathed a collective sigh of exhaustion. Even the marble seemed to slump with relief. Yet in that haze of candles, silk and vice, one can't help but marvel. This was the Renaissance, after all, an age of contradictions. Art and corruption, beauty and betrayal. Beneath Raphael's frescoes, men schemed like alley rats. Even the holiest offices weren't immune. And still, the church endured. So what's next? You'll walk through the papal apartments, where promotions were based on family trees, not faith, and discover why your last name meant more than your prayers. Rumor has it, if you were the Pope's nephew in the Middle Ages, your odds of becoming a cardinal were better than your odds of finding clean drinking water. So how did an entire church hierarchy become a glorified family business? Let's trace the scented trail of nepotism through Vatican halls. The term nepotism, from nepos, Latin for nephew, was practically coined inside papal walls. You step now into a frescoed corridor, where the walls may be holy, but the deals made here were anything but. This wasn't just favoritism. This was a system so entrenched, so brazen, that entire dynasties sprang from a single pope's cousin's son's marriage alliance. You pause beneath a family crest carved above a chapel door. It's not a saint symbol, it's the Medici balls, or the Borgia bull, or the Farnese lilies. All signs that someone's uncle wore the tiara and decided quite generously to elevate his relatives from minor nobles to cardinal princes. And when the Pope had no nephews, well, some nephews were simply invented. Historians still argue whether some nephews were in fact illegitimate sons cloaked in clerical robes. It was the perfect arrangement: call him your nephew, give him a red hat, and suddenly you've got influence that lives on past your papacy. After all, popes couldn't technically have heirs, but spiritual loopholes. Those were fair game. One of the most infamous purveyors of nepotism was Pope Sixtus IV. You remember him, the guy who commissioned the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Well, he also commissioned about a dozen family members into powerful positions, including 6 nephews into the cardinalate. One Giuliano della Rovere would become Pope Julius II, the very pope who made Michelangelo paint that ceiling while threatening to throw him off a scaffold. Then there was Pope Paul III, who appointed his teenage grandsons aged 14 and 16 as cardinals. You imagine them yawning during morning mass, bored stiff, while sitting on velvet thrones, counting the hours until they could sneak off for fencing lessons or diplomatic flirtation. Their spiritual training, likely limited to don't spill wine on the relics. But nepotism wasn't just about comfy jobs and fancy robes. It reshaped geopolitics. Cardinals with family ties to ruling houses meant alliances, land grants, and armies shifted with the pulse of papal favoritism. Entire wars began and ended based on who the Pope liked at breakfast. You'd think divine guidance would weigh more than a bloodline, but in this era, salvation often traveled by surname. You stroll past the remains of a secret stairwell where whispers once echoed. Nephews were given embassies control of papal states, and in some cases military command. If a nephew failed, he'd be quietly reassigned. If he succeeded, the whole family rose with him. Of course, the Church tried to fix this. Repeated decrees, especially after the Council of Trent, condemned nepotism outright. But enforcement, let's just say, inconsistent. The temptation was too great. After all, a pope was only pope for life. If he wanted to protect his family's fortune, his nephews were his best bet. Even as late as the 17th century, nepotism remained the Vatican's favorite open secret. Pope Urban VIII of the Barberini family showered titles and wealth on his relatives to such excess that the saying went, "What the barbarians didn't do, the Barberini did." You lean against a wall where time has softened the stone, imagining the eye rolls of less connected priests who studied, prayed, and starved their way to minor parish appointments, while 20-something nephews skipped the line with an arched eyebrow and a coat of arms. It makes you wonder how much of church history was shaped not by saints or scripture, but by a pope's family brunch plans. And if you think that's the most chaotic structure ever imposed on the Vatican, next we descend into an era so tangled with seduction and power, historians gave it its own name, the papal pornocracy. Before we go any further, ask yourself this: what happens when the most powerful man in Christendom is little more than a puppet in his lover's bedroom? Because for a few scandalous decades, the real rulers of the papacy weren't popes, but their mistresses. Welcome to the papal pornocracy. Now, despite the name, this wasn't some underground printing press of medieval erotica, though that wouldn't feel entirely out of place. The term pornocracy, or rule of the harlots, refers to a particularly murky period in the 10th century, when the Vatican was less kingdom of God and more family-run power cartel, operated by ambitious women and their very compromised clerical companions. You walk quietly along the ancient paving stones of Rome, past ivy-covered ruins and crumbling churches. The city is still half asleep in this century, struggling to regain its imperial glow. And into this vacuum of power steps Theophylact, a noble Roman with a thirst for influence, and his wife Theodora, who quickly makes it clear that being the wife of a power broker is not the limit of her ambitions. Together, they maneuver their teenage daughter Marozia into the thick of Vatican politics. And Marozia, she's not just a socialite. She becomes the mistress of Pope Sergius III, possibly while still in her teens, and eventually bears him a son. That son would grow up to become Pope John V, which is its own fever dream of hereditary holiness. Historians still argue whether Sergius III was complicit, coerced, or merely opportunistic, but the result was the same. Marozia held the reins. She arranged alliances, controlled appointments, and treated Rome like a chessboard. Her rivals didn't last long, and when popes tried to resist her influence, they often died suspiciously soon after. You duck under a moss-darkened archway, imagining Marozia gliding down a candlelit hall, her cloak trailing behind her like a shadow. She wasn't the only woman wielding such power, but she was the most infamous. After Sergius III, she married multiple noblemen, all conveniently situated to boost her influence, and continued to control the Vatican through a string of strategically selected popes. Eventually, Marozia even took the title Senatrix of Rome, a secular claim that cemented her de facto rule over the Eternal City. For nearly 3 decades, she was the power behind the throne, and sometimes in front of it. But power, as always, invites payback. Her downfall came at the hands of her own family. Her son, by another marriage, Alberic II, turned on her, imprisoned her, and seized control. Some accounts suggest she died in captivity. Others say she faded into obscurity. The papacy, she once shaped like clay, recoiled, vowing to reclaim its sanctity. Still, the damage had been done. The Church's reputation for purity was stained by this period of scandalous entanglement. Chronicles from across Europe whispered about the shameless women who ruled the Pope as they pleased. It was the Middle Ages' worst-kept secret. And yet not all scholars condemn Marozia and her kin. Some view her as a brilliant tactician in a patriarchal system, a woman who wielded the tools available to her with unmatched precision. Others call her a villain in a stolen veil. The truth, as always, likely lives somewhere between the footnotes. What remains undeniable is the legacy and era where the Vatican was steered not by saints or scholars, but by the quiet cunning of a noblewoman and her intimate circle. But don't think every pope was satisfied with velvet whispers. Some wanted steel in their hands and a horse beneath them. Next, you'll ride beside the popes who traded psalms for plate armor and led armies into battle. Okay, real question. What does a pope wear into battle chainmail under his robes? A helmet over the mitre. Because yes, there was a time when popes didn't just bless the swords of kings, they wielded them. You're about to saddle up beside the warrior, popes of medieval Christendom. It might sound like fiction, but it's very real. Imagine the spiritual leader of the Christian world, leading cavalry charges, rallying troops, and personally overseeing sieges. The papacy, especially during the High Middle Ages and Renaissance, wasn't content to be a passive spiritual voice. It became an armed power with territory to defend and rivals to crush. You stand at the gates of the Castel San Angelo, a looming fortress just steps from the Vatican. Once a Roman mausoleum, it became a papal stronghold, a place where popes not only hid during invasions, but launched attacks. And the man who perhaps most embodied this martial spirit, Pope Julius II. Yes, the same Julius II who commissioned Michelangelo's ceiling was also known as the warrior pope. He didn't just rule from a throne, he rode into battle in full armor, clad in silver plate and purple plumes. You can almost hear the clink of metal as he mounted his warhorse, determined to reclaim papal territories in central Italy. Historians still argue whether his military actions were necessary or just glorified land grabs. But one thing's for sure, he didn't hide behind holy texts. He led campaigns, negotiated with mercenaries, and defied kings. At the siege of Mirandola in 1511, Julius arrived at the front lines during a snowstorm and insisted on entering the conquered city through a breach in the wall just to prove a point. You lean over the battlements, imagining the Pope's breath fogging the cold air, his soldiers chanting prayers between volleys of arrows. To some, it was inspiring. To others, deeply unsettling. A shepherd of souls clad in armor charging into the fray, too. But Julius II wasn't alone in this tradition. Earlier popes like Leo IV had also taken to arms. In 849, Leo rallied troops to defend Rome against Saracen pirates, reportedly overseeing the victory at the Battle of Ostia. His actions were later mythologized in frescoes showing him giving blessings over naval fleets. And then there's Urban II, whose rallying cry at the Council of Clermont in 1095 launched the First Crusade. While he didn't personally lead troops, his words stirred thousands to war, binding the Church directly to bloodshed. Later popes, like Innocent III and Gregory IX, continued this trend, sending armies under papal banners to fight not only Muslims abroad, but heretics at home. You walk through a silent armory, tucked behind the Vatican walls, imagining a place where robes once hung beside swords, where relics of saints shared shelves with gauntlets and maps marked for conquest. Papal war was as much about defending land as it was about asserting divine right. But this duality came at a cost. Critics, then and now, argued that warrior popes blurred the line between holy leadership and political ambition. Was the Pope still the vicar of Christ, or had he become just another warlord with better branding? Even within Rome, some clergy balked at the sight of their leader bloodied from campaign, yet others rallied around the idea. A strong pope could protect the Church from corruption and foreign manipulation, or so the theory went. The legacy of these warrior popes is painted on chapel walls, etched into battlements, and whispered through corridors. You can still feel it today, the strange tension between the sword and the cross. But warfare wasn't their only weapon. Next, we'll explore how excommunication became the Vatican's most feared and convenient form of political chess. Next time someone tells you the pen is mightier than the sword, consider this. What if your name scribbled on a papal scroll meant you were cut off from God, your lands, your crown, and maybe even your breakfast? Let's talk about how excommunication became the Pope's deadliest, non-lethal weapon. You stroll through a medieval scriptorium where candlelight flickers over red wax seals and stiff parchment scrolls. In the silence, you can almost hear the scratching of quills as scribes pen the doom of kings. These aren't just letters, they are spiritual death sentences. And when the Pope signs, one entire kingdom shudder. Excommunication wasn't just a personal shame, it was political annihilation. To be excommunicated meant you were cast out of the Church, denied the sacraments, and publicly branded as unfit to rule. In a time when divine authority underpinned all earthly power, that was like flipping a table in heaven and telling everyone at court, this guy's going to hell. Historians still argue whether popes used excommunication primarily for moral correction or political gain. Spoiler alert, often it was both. You step into the ghost of a throne room where a monarch once learned he'd been exiled not by sword, but by ink. And he wasn't alone. One of the most famous excommunications came in 1076 when Pope Gregory VII excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. Why Henry tried to depose the Pope, never a smart move. In response, Gregory cut him off from the Church. The fallout was so severe that Henry had to cross the Alps barefoot in the snow and wait outside the Pope's castle for 3 days before being granted forgiveness. That scene, known as the Walk to Canossa, became a defining image of papal power. You can almost feel the frostbite just thinking about it. But Gregory wasn't the only pope who enjoyed a well-timed excommunication. Innocent III wielded it like a maestro. He excommunicated King John of England, refused to recognize Philip II's divorce, and kicked off the Fourth Crusade with such theatrical flair that Venice is probably still recovering. He made sure everyone knew challenge the papacy, and you'd wake up spiritually evicted. Sometimes entire regions were placed under interdict, a sort of mass excommunication, where churches were closed, marriages forbidden, and funerals denied. Can you imagine the spiritual panic townsfolk would gather at locked chapel doors, weeping not just for their souls, but for their children, their dead, their future? The Pope didn't have to swing a sword. He just had to close heaven. You pass a crumbling city gate marked with old graffiti symbols of protest, desperate prayers, maybe a curse or two. Because excommunication wasn't just a weapon of piety, it was psychological warfare. Even after the Protestant Reformation, the threat retained its sting. In 1538, Pope Paul III excommunicated Henry VIII, not just for divorcing his wife, but for declaring himself head of the Church of England. It wasn't an idle gesture. It fractured Christendom and made the papacy's spiritual reach a global matter. Yet, like all weapons, overuse dulled its edge. By the 17th century, excommunications were more political theater than divine thunderbolts. People began to question whether the Pope's words carried eternal weight or just temporary inconvenience. Still, the ritual, the public reading the bell, tolling the candle snuffing retained its eerie power. You watch a mental image play out: a bishop lifting his hand, a scroll unfurled, a name spoken. The air grows cold. The people murmur. Somewhere a nobleman clutches his chest, not from grief, but fear of being forgotten by heaven itself. The power to sever someone from God. Now that's influence. But not all Vatican secrets involved parchment and politics. Next, you'll step into the quietest chamber of all, the confessional, where betrayal whispered through wooden screens could topple kings. Confession is supposed to be a sacred refuge where your darkest secrets disappear into candlelight and Latin whispers. But what if the person behind the screen was also holding a quill and a list? You're about to enter the most dangerous booth in medieval Christendom. The confessional, that little wooden sanctuary tucked inside shadowed naves, might seem like the safest space in the Christian world. Sins and absolution out. But during the Middle Ages, this spiritual DMV took on a double life as both haven and hazard. You step inside, now feeling the polished grain beneath your fingertips, the musky scent of incense soaked deep into the walls, and just over your shoulder, the silence hums with tension. Because in an era where politics mingled with piety, confession could be weaponized. Whispers became currency. Secrets flowed in, and not all of them stayed put. Historians still argue whether certain confessions were used deliberately for espionage, blackmail, or influence. But the stories persist. One tale from 14th century France tells of a bishop's confessor who relayed sensitive information about noble alliances, leading to arrests, executions, and a sudden retirement for the clergyman in question. You picture a penitent noble kneeling voice, trembling, as he admits to treasonous thoughts, or worse, actual plans. The priest listens, pauses, and later in the privacy of his study scribbles a coded letter to a cardinal in Rome. Forgiveness granted, but not without footnotes. Technically, the seal of confession was absolute. The church taught that priests who broke it would be excommunicated, possibly even executed. And yet gray areas loomed. Some popes, especially those in tight political corners, encouraged confessors to voluntarily report dangerous plots. After all, was it still a sin if it protected the church? You pass through a narrow hallway where inquisitors once paced minds, racing with guilt-laced jigsaw puzzles. The Inquisition, too, blurred the line between salvation and surveillance. Confessions were often extracted through pressure suggestion or fear, then preserved in secret archives where ink outlived its speakers. Even kings weren't safe. Queen Isabella of Castile allegedly used confessional intelligence to preempt noble revolts. And in Renaissance Italy, it was widely believed that spies disguised as friars frequented the courts of Florence and Naples, offering spiritual comfort while harvesting whispers. One of the most unsettling stories involves Pope Clement VII. During the sack of Rome in 1527, it's rumored that terrified citizens flooded the confessionals, revealing hidden gold escape plans, even betrayals. Some of that information mysteriously found its way to both papal allies and enemies. Did the priests break the seal? Or did desperate informants use the booth as a loophole? You sit for a moment on a pew, imagining the confessionals as medieval switchboards, relaying not just sins, but survival strategies. Did the priest pray over what he'd heard, or pass it on to someone in velvet robes? Of course, many confessions remain sacred. Most priests, even when faced with torture, refused to break their vow, and some died for it. Their stories are quieter, buried in parish records, and martyrdoms no one dramatized. Still, the existence of those rumors hints at a wider truth: information was power. And confession, for all its holiness, was an irresistible funnel of unfiltered truths. You think about modern equivalents: private messages, anonymous hotlines, encrypted apps. But none carried the weight of eternal judgment quite like the confessional. And speaking of eternal things, what happens when popes start commissioning art with one hand and selling forgiveness with the other? Next, we step into the golden halls of Renaissance Rome, where piety was polished and sin could be cleared for a fee. No sin too big, no wallet, too small step, right up. Ever wonder what happens when salvation becomes a business model? Tonight you'll wander gilded corridors where popes funded palaces by selling forgiveness like carnival tickets, and where every brushstroke of Renaissance art may have been bought with someone else's guilt. You're now strolling through the Vatican in the late 15th century, a place shimmering with new wealth. Tapestries ripple in the breeze, marble floors gleam beneath your boots, and choirs echo through domed ceilings. But beneath the beauty lies a different kind of transaction indulgences. Not spiritual dedication, but paper slips bought and sold to guarantee quicker passage through purgatory or avoid it altogether. You pause before a side altar where pilgrims once knelt in earnest prayer, and then dropped coins into boxes marked remission. Officially, indulgences were meant to reward acts of devotion, pilgrimage, charity, fasting. But in practice, they turned into a divine economy where grace had a price tag and the papal coffers swelled. Historians still argue whether this system was ever truly benevolent or just convenient. What's clear is that Renaissance popes leaned into it with gusto. Pope Leo X, for example, the one who oversaw the early stages of St. Peter's Basilica, used indulgence sales to finance its construction. His infamous quote, "God has given us the papacy. Let us enjoy it." You raise your eyebrows. That enjoyment included feasts, elephant parades, we'll get there soon, and enough art commissions to make Florence jealous. Enter Johann Tetzel, the indulgence hawker, whose sales pitch rang out across German towns. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings a soul from Purgatory Springs. Tetzel's sermons were dramatic, his message clear. Your deceased loved ones were suffering, and only you could save them, with money. Imagine being a poor farmer, clutching a coin desperate to help your dead mother, or a guilt-ridden noble tossing a gold florin into the pot and walking away with a printed certificate of divine mercy. The lines blurred. Forgiveness became productized. All this would have been scandalous enough, but remember, it funded some of the most breathtaking art in Western history. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, Raphael's frescoes, Bernini's glorious sculptures. You walk among them now bathed in chiaroscuro and contradiction. Beauty born from bribery or from belief. The problem came when critics started asking that exact question. A fiery German monk named Martin Luther nailed 95 such questions to a church door in 1517 and launched a movement that split Christendom in two. The Reformation wasn't just a theological debate, it was a revolt against this commodified grace. Yet even as the church reeled, the practice endured in subtler forms. Relic veneration, pilgrimage souvenirs, blessed medallions all flirted with the same dynamic faith, plus funds equals favor. Was it hope or just clever marketing? You step through a sacristy where robes embroidered with gold thread glimmer in the half-light. Somewhere in these halls, an artist wept over a commission while a sinner wept over their soul. Both paid, both prayed, both walked away, changed. There's something haunting about that kind of economy. Forgiveness as ledger entries, mercy outsourced to middlemen, and at the center, a pope smiling beneath a painted dome, signing indulgences with the same hand that blessed kings. And speaking of strange papal companions, next you'll meet a pontiff's beloved pet, who received dignitaries caused theological panic and pooped in the Vatican gardens. Yes, really. Some popes had mistresses, others had armies, but one had an elephant. What happens when a pontiff becomes so obsessed with his pachyderm pet that it receives visitors like a cardinal, and its bathroom breaks cause international theological confusion? Say hello to Hanno, the short-lived but unforgettable elephant of Pope Leo VI. The year is 1514, and you're standing at the gates of Rome, watching a parade wind its way toward the Vatican. Drummers beat flower petals rain down, and at the center of it all, a gleaming white elephant with golden tusks and a brocade saddle swaying through the crowd like it owns the world. And in a way, it did. Hanno was a gift from King Manuel I of Portugal, part of a diplomatic offering meant to flatter and dazzle the new pope. It worked. Leo X, already a lover of animals, exotic gifts, and dramatic flair, was instantly smitten. The elephant became his pride and joy, a living emblem of Renaissance opulence and papal grandeur. You imagine Hanno clomping through the Vatican gardens, flanked by whispering courtiers and curious cardinals. He was stabled near the Belvedere courtyard, fed lavishly, and even appeared in ceremonial processions. When foreign dignitaries arrived, they were often greeted not just by clergy, but by this trunked ambassador swaying gently, swatting flies with regal disinterest. Historians still argue whether Hanno was truly treated with reverence or simply novelty. But evidence suggests the Pope loved him dearly. In fact, Leo commissioned the artist Raphael to design a special mural of the elephant. Sadly, it no longer survives. but Hanno's memory lingers in sketches, letters, and one rather unfortunate incident. In 1516, Hanno fell ill, likely from a combination of diet stress and bizarrely gold-laced laxatives. Yes, in an attempt to cure his beloved pet's constipation, Leo's physicians fed him a concoction containing real gold. The result? Hanno died in agony. The Pope was devastated. He ordered an elaborate funeral complete with ceremonial poems and burial near the Vatican. A papal bull, not the animal. The document even recorded the event with sorrowful flair. You stand now over the ghost of that grave, unsure whether to laugh, weep, or shake your head. But what does it all mean? For some, Hanno symbolized the height of papal extravagance, more concerned with exotic pets than church reform. For others, he's a poignant reminder that even the most powerful men in Christendom could be undone by love sentiment and really bad veterinary advice. You look out across the city, imagining the soft clomp of elephant feet echoing off cobbled streets. The Vatican hasn't had another elephant since. Maybe once was enough. Still, the tale of Hanno lingers like the scent of incense, unexpected, oddly touching, and just a little ridiculous. And next things get even more complicated. What happens when rival popes start popping up like competing food carts? You're about to enter the Western Schism, where there were 3 popes, 0 clarity, and a whole lot of excommunications. Ever tried following a leader and realized there were 3 of them? What happens when the Pope excommunicates the Pope, and then a 3rd Pope shows up to excommunicate them both? Tonight, you're caught in the Western Schism, where spiritual authority, splintered egos inflated, and the faithful had to pick a side. It's 1378, and you find yourself in Rome at the tail end of a conclave meant to bring order. The people are restless, the cardinals anxious. The air tastes like political pressure and overdue promises. After 70 years of papal residence in Avignon, France, the world demands the Bishop of Rome return to Rome. So under intense Roman pressure, read an angry mob, the cardinals hastily elect Pope Urban VI. At first, it seems like a victory. Urban is Italian, stern, reform-minded. But quickly things unravel. His temper is volcanic. He insults the cardinals, fires staff indiscriminately, and rules with a sharp tongue dipped in vinegar. The same cardinals who elected him now claim they did so under duress. So they huddle whisper, and within months, elect a 2nd pope, Clement VII. He sets up shop back in Avignon. 2 popes, 2 courts, 2 sets of bulls' blessings and bans. You peek into a parish and see confused worshippers asking, which one do we follow? Bishops are torn. Kings choose sides. France, Scotland, and Spain back Clement. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy stick with Urban. Historians still argue whether the cardinals truly feared for their lives during that first conclave or just regretted their choice. But the damage is done. For nearly 40 years, Christendom is split. Each pope accuses the other of heresy. Each excommunicates the other's followers. The papal office, once seen as a rock, now resembles a revolving door with a trapdoor underneath. You step into the hallowed chambers of the Vatican and picture a letter arriving. It's from a bishop across the Alps, unsure who to report to. Or a priest in Spain suddenly declared a schismatic for backing the wrong pope. Faith becomes geography, and just when it seems things can't get worse, they do. In 1409, a group of well-meaning clerics meet at the Council of Pisa to fix the mess. Their brilliant solution: elect a 3rd pope. Now we have Alexander V in Pisa, Gregory XIII in Rome, and Benedict XIII in Avignon. 3 popes, triple the excommunications, and 0 peace. Imagine Easter services that year, three different liturgies, three different blessings, all claiming divine authority. It's not just awkward, it's deeply destabilizing. The papacy becomes a punchline. Eventually, the Council of Constance, 1414 and 1418, puts an end to the madness. Gregory XIII resigns voluntarily, the other two are deposed or ignored, and a new Pope, Martin V, is elected. Finally, the Church reunites, but the cracks remain visible. The papacy's reputation, once untouchable, now feels fragile. You stroll past a fresco depicting Christ handing Peter the keys to heaven. But tonight, the keys feel like they've changed hands a few too many times. Still, the Church survives. Somehow. And as we come to the end of this journey through scandal and incense power and pageantry, you'll soon return to where we began, whispers in the dark saints and sinners in the same red robes. So after all the bribery, bones, battles, and elephants, you might be wondering, did any of it actually matter? Before we close the book tonight, we return to velvet thrones and candlelit chapels, where history's loudest scandals fade into whispered prayers, and the legacy of scandalous popes is weighed against their sacred office. You're back in Rome now, standing once more in St. Peter's Basilica. The incense curls slowly toward the vaulted ceiling. A choir hums a hymn from centuries past. It's easy to imagine only peace and piety lived here. But you know better now. You've walked the corridors of corruption, stepped into confessionals with hidden agendas, and ridden beside popes with swords on their hips. And yet this place endures. History has a way of sanding down its edges. The popes you've met tonight, with their affairs and armories, their nephews and indulgences, are rarely mentioned in Sunday sermons. They're tucked behind theological doctrine and Renaissance artwork, softened by time and blurred by the sheer enormity of the Church's presence. Historians still argue whether these scandals eroded the faith of the people or merely proved that the divine can coexist with the deeply flawed. After all, most believers prayed to God, not the Pope. The office might have been wrapped in human folly, but the faith it represented often thrived in spite of it. You stroll past the statue of St. Peter, his bronze foot worn smooth by centuries of pilgrim kisses. Some of those kisses came during the darkest days after war, famine, schism, and scandal. Still they came. Hope outlived disgrace. Take Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope. For all his misdeeds, he strengthened papal control of the Papal States. Julius II, the armored pontiff, commissioned the rebuilding of St. Peter's. Even Benedict IX, who sold the papacy like a stall vendor, left behind lessons in what not to do, lessons the Church would wrestle with for centuries. You sit quietly in a pew. Somewhere a bell tolls. The marble beneath your feet is cracked but polished. That's the paradox, isn't it? A church built on both faith and fallibility, on saints who doubted and sinners who ruled. And maybe that's why the stories linger, because they remind us that history isn't a straight line. It curves. It contradicts. It laughs when we expect solemnity and whispers when we demand answers. You recall Pope Joan's legend, perhaps false, perhaps real, but undeniably powerful. You think of Hanno, the elephant remembered not for theology, but for love and loss. You remember the corpse trial the papal power plays, and the scrolls of excommunication floating like spiritual grenades through medieval Europe. Each story absurd, each one real or real enough to echo. And now at the end, the candles have burned low. The basilica is nearly empty. The throne of St. Peter stands still. Tonight you've met the popes they don't put in textbooks, the ones with wine stains on their vestments and secrets stitched into their cassocks. But here's the final twist. They're part of the same tapestry. Scandal doesn't sit outside history. It is history. And as the last flicker of candlelight fades into the velvet dark, let's drift together into sleep, knowing that even the holiest halls are haunted not just by saints, but by stories. Tonight, we slip behind thick stone walls and beneath quiet cloisters to explore a world of simplicity structure and the occasional scribbled duck in the margins of sacred texts. Welcome to the realm of medieval monks, where the days were long, the meals were modest, and silence was somehow louder than speech. You enter not through a grand cathedral door, but through a modest gate, flanked by rose bushes, one creaking on its hinges like it remembers every footstep before yours. Imagine waking up, not to a phone alarm, but to a bell rung by a sleepy novice before dawn. The rooms are cold, the blankets thin, and your pillow is, well, non-existent. You pull on a simple robe, coarse wool, always wool, and slip your feet into wooden clogs polished only by time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing our sleepy little map of listeners. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in the cloister now. Not just a physical space, but a rhythm. Every stone path leads somewhere sacred, or at least orderly. You're surrounded by arches, vines crawling lazily along the walls, and quiet figures moving like ghosts in brown robes. The Benedictine rule, the big boss of monk instructions, tells you when to pray, when to eat, and how to properly tie your belt left over right. Please. It's a life free from distraction. Unless you count Brother Edwin's chronic sneezing fits, or the occasional sheep wandering into the herb garden. Most monasteries are self-contained chapel dormitory, kitchen library, garden brewery. Each section hums with quiet purpose. You'll notice there's no division between spiritual and mundane here. Scrubbing pots is just as holy as chanting psalms. You're guided through your first day by an elder with more wrinkles than the Book of Psalms has verses. He doesn't speak much, but his nods are encyclopedic. He points out the hours you'll need to remember Matins, Lauds Prime, Terce, Sext None, Vespers, and Compline. You'll chant at every one, your voice blending into a sea of sleepy Latin syllables. You begin to notice things, the way light filters through stained glass at certain times of day, how every echo seems intentional. Even the silence isn't really silent. There's always the rustle of robes, a distant cough, the clink of wooden spoons at breakfast. The monks walk with their hands tucked in sleeves, not out of reverence, but because their cloaks don't have pockets. You pass a young scribe muttering vowels to himself, and a gardener gently reprimanding a snail. Despite the order, things aren't dull. One monk bakes bread that mysteriously always comes out heart-shaped. Another carves spoons with tiny faces on the handles. These quirks aren't punished. They're absorbed into the monastery's personality like moss on stone. Historians still argue whether monks lived lives of contentment or quiet desperation. But as you follow the day's gentle rhythm, your modern chaos begins to melt. There's something soothing in knowing exactly what comes next, and that no one expects you to multitask. You end your first day the way you began it, with bells. Compline sounds more like a lullaby than a ritual. In the flickering candlelight, you walk to your cell, curl up on your straw mattress, and listen to the wind hum through the high windows. No buzzing phones, no calendar alerts, just the soft murmur of prayer, and maybe a ghostly whisper of Gregorian chant. Before clocks ticked and alarms buzzed, how did monks know when to pray? Was there a secret, monk-only sunrise schedule? Or perhaps an ancient version of the snooze button carved into stone? You're about to find out how medieval monasteries ran like clockwork without a single timepiece in sight. You rise before dawn again, your second full day in the cloister. You didn't sleep well, but somehow you feel calmer. Maybe it's the absence of screens, or maybe it's the sheer predictability of everything. You already know what robe to wear, what words to murmur as you lace your sandals and where your seat is in the chapel. But what you don't know is how they're doing it. The first bell tolls at an hour so early that even the moon looks annoyed. Yet everyone rises at just the right moment, no fumbling, no grumbling. It's like they can feel time. Turns out they kind of can. In a world without mechanical clocks, the passage of time was both sacred and sensory. Monks learned to recognize the subtle shifts in light through stained glass windows, the crispness of morning air, and even the temperature of the stone floor beneath their feet. The day is divided into canonical hours, those fancy labels you memorized yesterday, matins, lauds, prime, etc. Each marks a prayer, and prayer marks the day. But behind these divine appointments lies a logistical masterpiece. How do you ring a bell for prime if you don't know it's 600 a.m.? Enter the nocturnal. No, not a spooky creature. A nocturnal was a circular star clock used by monks to track time by the stars. Think of it like a divine astrolabe. If you could read Ursa Minor, you could find your way to matins. The sky was your schedule. You follow Brother Gervais, the bell ringer, on his pre-dawn rounds. He carries no watch. Instead, he tilts his head to the stars' eyes, squinting at constellations you barely remember from a childhood planetarium trip. Then, with a slight nod, he disappears into the belfry and hauls the rope. Other monasteries employed more homegrown methods, hour candles, where each inch of wax burned marked a set number of minutes, or water clocks, brass bowls, with holes that sank slowly in a tub. They were primitive, leaky, and sometimes inaccurate, but in a world devoted to rhythm over precision, that didn't matter. In the chapel, you notice something new today. The chanting starts not with voices, but with a gentle hum, a throat clearing maybe. Then one voice starts, and the others pour in like honey over bread. No conductor, no countdown. Just the shared muscle memory of men who've prayed the same words in the same spot for years. You begin to understand how the clock isn't on the wall, it's in the body. The days form a rhythm so deeply etched into the routine that even the sparrows seem to chirp on cue. And it's not all perfect. Sometimes the bell is late. Sometimes Brother Alric the timekeeper nods off and has to be nudged by a sheepish novice. Sometimes a candle gets snuffed out by a draft, and time literally disappears. Yet the monastic world adjusts. You overhear one monk joke that time bends for prayer, not the other way around. Another calls it God's playlist, and everyone nods solemnly. Historians still argue whether medieval monasteries truly kept time more accurately than secular towns, but it's clear they cared more. While city clocks tolled noonish bells to empty markets, monks were aligning their prayers with the stars, the seasons, and even the migratory patterns of birds. You spend part of the morning in the kitchen, helping slice root vegetables. Brother Simon talks about how during winter, they rely more on internal clocks, how your body wakes you up hungry just before prime, or how the sun rising late means longer chance to fill the dark. In some far northern monasteries, monks even devised sun tubes, hollowed out stones placed in the walls that caught the first glint of daylight and beamed it onto the chapel floor. When the light hit the altar, it was time to chant. Medieval laser beams in a way. And then there's the Angelus bell, the evening ring that you'll come to love. Its timing varies across Europe, but its sound always triggers the same reflex pause, pray reflect. Some say it originated with monks watching geese return to their roosts. Others say it was simply when the light turned gold on the cloister walls. Before lunch, you sneak into the bell tower. The ropes are thick and frayed, the stairs narrow and spiraling. Up top, the view is breathtaking. The monastery's neatly geometric garden below looks like a chessboard designed by someone obsessed with fennel. You can see how the sunlight strikes different corners through the day, creating a natural time dial. It's quieter up here. Just the wind and the occasional squeak of wooden beams. You imagine being the bell ringer centuries ago, charged with tracking time by feel, sky, and candle, and still managing to rouse a dozen half-asleep monks without a single snooze button. As evening sets in, you sit on a cold bench beneath a beech tree, watching the sun dip low behind the cloister walls. The bells ring out again, this time for vespers. The sound echoes like a heartbeat, measured and sure. And even though you're a visitor, you find yourself rising with the others, robes brushing against stone footsteps in sync. You don't check a watch. You don't even look at the sky. You just know. Time here is not an enemy to be chased. It's a companion walking beside you in silence. You've heard of medieval monks as solemn scholars, but what if their most sacred texts hid silly scribbles? Could divine manuscripts share margins with dancing snails, farting jesters, or knights dueling slugs? Prepare to enter the scriptorium, where silence reigned, but the margins sometimes giggled. It smells of ink and melted beeswax in here. You step into the scriptorium, a long hall lit by narrow windows that drip golden light across oaken desks. Each writing station is arranged with monk-like precision, a quill trimmed just right, a knife to scrape mistakes, a parchment sheet, and sometimes a stone to keep your elbow from trembling. The room is hushed, but not quite silent. You hear the faint scratching of quills, a cough muffled in woolen sleeves, the occasional creak of a wooden stool adjusting under a habit-heavy backside. A white-robed brother gives you a look that says, "Don't bump the desk, or you'll go straight to parchment purgatory." Scribes were the sacred copy machines of the medieval world. But unlike machines, they got tired and bored. Very bored. You watch Brother Arnulf work. He leans over a massive manuscript, laboriously copying a commentary on St. Jerome. His face is a mask of focus. His hand moves with ritualistic precision, and then he pauses. He stretches. He turns to a blank margin and draws a snail. Not a symbolic snail, not a moral snail, just a snail, wearing what might be a tiny helmet. You try not to laugh. These marginal doodles called marginalia are real. They show up in manuscripts all over Europe. Historians still argue about their purpose. Were they inside jokes, among monks, little acts of rebellion, or just the medieval equivalent of doodling in the margins of your homework? Whatever the reason, the result is delightful. You move from station to station, peeking over shoulders, with permission, of course. One monk has drawn a rabbit jousting a knight. Another has a monk being chased by a goose. There's even one where a cat is pooping into a chalice. A bit rude, sure, but undeniably human. And it's not just jokes. You notice intricate floral borders, dragons with far too many teeth, angels looking mildly exasperated. The pages are alive with imagination, detail, and personality. It's as if the monks couldn't help but let a bit of themselves sneak in, even while copying the Word of God. A few desks down, a novice is illuminating a capital Q with real gold leaf. He dabs the surface gently, his tongue sticking out in focus. Inside the letter, he's drawn a fox playing the lute. You blink. Yep, that's definitely a fox. And it's definitely shredding on a lute. These images were never meant for public eyes. Most people couldn't read. Manuscripts were treasures locked away in monastic libraries. The marginalia were for the monks alone, little Easter eggs tucked between psalms and sermons. You ask Brother Audric, an elder scribe, why they do it. He smiles without looking up and says, because even monks have Tuesdays. Apparently Tuesdays are the slowest, sleepiest day of the week. Perfect for hiding a dancing bear in the corner of a sermon about humility. The rules were clear copy: faithfully respect the word, keep the pages neat. But as long as you didn't smudge the scripture, a little artistic flair in the margins wasn't forbidden. In fact, some abbots quietly encouraged it as a way to keep scribes sane during long copying marathons that could last months. You settle beside a young monk and try your hand at it. The quill feels awkward. The ink bleeds unpredictably, and your R looks like it's melting. But there's something oddly soothing about the rhythm of dip scratch. Pause, breathe. The monk beside you leans over and whispers, "You'll be lucky if your goose looks like a goose." You glance down. He's right. Yours looks more like a sad potato with wings. Even the mistakes are charming. Some pages show corrections where a scribe tried to erase a line with a knife or added a note, like I was very tired when I wrote this in Latin. One manuscript has a passive-aggressive footnote. Whoever reads this, remember the work of the scribe who wrote it. As the afternoon sun shifts, the scriptorium gets warmer. A few monks nod off heads lolling over open psalters. You spot one fellow trying to stay awake by chewing the end of his quill. He notices your amused look and shrugs. Better ink than snoring. There's pride in the work, too. Some books are so beautifully copied and decorated they took years to complete. Monks didn't sign their names. Modesty, always. Modesty. But sometimes they'd sneak in a symbol, a favorite flower, a certain bird, even a tiny version of themselves in the border. And not all doodles are silly. Some reflect fear, anxiety, or dreams. Monsters creeping from the edge of the page, labyrinths drawn in tight spirals, tiny towers surrounded by flames. The margins became not just a playground, but a confessional. Historians still debate whether marginalia had deeper meanings. Was the rabbit knight a symbol of cowardice conquering fear? Was the farting nun a satire of ecclesiastical excess? Or were monks just poking fun at their own rigid world, one snail at a time? As twilight approaches, the scriptorium empties slowly. Monks stretch, gather their tools, and bow slightly to the page before closing it. You stay behind a moment longer, admiring one last manuscript where a unicorn shares tea with a bishop. You can't help but smile. There's a quiet magic in this room, a mix of discipline and whimsy devotion, and rebellion ink and imagination. You realize that these silent scribes, often thought of as humorless drones, were secretly some of history's gentlest pranksters. As you rise to leave, Brother Arnulf slides a small scrap of parchment into your sleeve. On it, a doodle of you wide-eyed and modern-looking, being chased by an angry quill. You nod respectfully. then giggle all the way to vespers. Why would a monk hold up two fingers during dinner, or tug his ear at breakfast? What happens when you're forbidden to speak, but still really need the butter? Welcome to the silent code of monastic life, where gestures spoke louder than words and loopholes flourished in the hush. This morning, the monastery feels even quieter than usual. Not just peaceful, intentionally quiet. You notice the change at breakfast. No murmured blessings, no sleepy banter about rainfall, not even the usual throat clearing from Brother Raban. Just the clink of wooden spoons and the rhythmic chewing of a dozen monks trying not to slurp too loudly. You've stumbled into a vow of silence day. Not every monastery required lifelong silence, contrary to Hollywood myths. But many imposed strict silence during certain hours, especially during meals, prayers, and contemplative walks. The idea was to encourage focused discipline and internal prayer. The result, a community of highly expressive eyebrows and the world's first emoji system. Sort of. You sit near Brother Edwin, who greets you with a gentle smile and a quick series of gestures, two fingers pointed upward, peace hand over heart blessing, quick pinch of his earlobe. Listen up. You blink, uncertain. He chuckles silently and hands you a small wax tablet. Yes, wax tablets. The original post-it note. Monks who couldn't speak often carried one around to scribble urgent things like, "The cheese is spoiled," or "Don't sit on the cat." More often, though, they used hand signals, codified and practiced over years. There were signs for bread, wine saltfish, even specific books in the library. Some monasteries had hundreds of gestures, often shared only within that particular community. You glance across the refectory. One monk makes a slow circular motion over his bowl. He wants more porridge. Another touches 3 fingers to his lips, then points at Brother Eustace. Translation. He took the last date again, but silence didn't mean stillness. In fact, it made other senses sharper. You begin to notice every rustle of robe, every footstep, the soft tap-tap of a spoon against a ceramic rim. Even laughter becomes silent shoulders, shaking eyes, crinkling faces turned to napkins. Historians still debate how strictly these silence rules were enforced. Did monks get scolded for accidental sneezes? Were silent gestures really encouraged or just tolerated? Some abbots were stricter than others, and a few were suspicious of gestures, altogether claiming they could invite pride or deception. And yes, loopholes abounded. You accompany a monk through the cloister walk, one of the few places where even gestures are discouraged. The pathway is enclosed with high arches and gravel underfoot. He walks slowly, hands folded, eyes lowered. You try it, and instantly realize how much mental noise you usually carry. Without words, your brain starts whispering louder. What's for lunch? Do I smell lavender? Is that squirrel following me? By mid-morning, you're in the garden, helping weed a patch of medicinal herbs. The silence there is less rigid, gentle gestures are allowed. You find yourself enjoying it. There's something liberating about communicating without words. A smile, a raised brow, a shrug, they all gain weight. At one point, Brother Peter mimics a butterfly, flapping, then points to the sky. You follow his finger and see it one perfect gliding monarch dancing above the time. You nod. He nods. No one says a thing. But somehow, you've shared something sacred. Not all gestures were about butterflies, of course. There were signs for confession illness, even emergency bathroom breaks. Some monks developed elaborate pantomimes, especially when novices were being trained. One story tells of a monk who faked an entire parable using only his hands' facial expressions and a bowl of turnips. After midday prayers, you gather in the warming room, a rare semi-heated chamber where monks dry wet socks and sometimes sneak naps. Here, the silence rule relaxes slightly, and whispers are tolerated. A few monks begin playing a kind of silent charades, acting out saints' lives or famous biblical stories. One mimics a lion, another pretends to walk on water. The game ends when someone pantomimes a fish, coughing St. Peter naturally, and everyone dissolves into muffled laughter. Despite the silence, there's a deep sense of connection. You realize how often modern speech is filled with filler small talk, complaints, retorts. Here, communication is intentional, purposeful, kind. You're handed a small vellum booklet after lunch, a guide to monastic hand signs. It's filled with delightfully specific drawings. A loop made with thumb and forefinger means cheese. A chopping motion across the palm means herbs. Wagging one finger sternly means not yours. You study it like a tourist with a phrase book. And just when you think you've got it, you make the classic mistake, gesturing milk when you meant bread. The monk across from you raises a brow, then hands you a cup of milk anyway. No judgment, just quiet generosity. Not all monks embraced the silence equally. Some chafed at the restriction, finding it isolating. Others leaned into it so much they hardly spoke, even when allowed. A few rare figures, conversi or lay brothers, were exempt from silence because they handled outside labor and trade. But even they adopted many of the gestures when among their cloistered brothers. There's one final lesson late in the day. A young novice breaks silence with a loud hiccup during chapel. Everyone freezes. Then the abbot slowly raises one eyebrow, pats his chest, and mimics a gentle exhale. The boy nods and blushes, the hiccup acknowledged and forgiven without a word. As night falls, the silence deepens. The gestures grow fewer, the movements slower. You find yourself thinking more, speaking less, even inside your own head. It's as if the quiet wraps itself around your thoughts like a warm woolen robe. You walk back to your cell without needing to ask directions. A monk passes you, touches two fingers to his lips, then presses them to his heart. You do the same, and not a single syllable is spoken. Some say fish was the monk's favorite food, but what if half of those fish had feathers, paws, or even hooves? Could the church's fasting rules be bendier than they appeared? Tonight, you step into the monastery kitchen, where creative cooking met divine loopholes in the name of piety and protein. The kitchen smells like smoke onions and something suspiciously fishy, but not in a bad way. It's early morning, and a fine mist hangs over the garden just outside. Inside, fires crackle gently beneath blackened pots, and you hear the soft thunk of a cleaver meeting cabbage. Today's your turn in the kitchen rota. You tie on a linen apron and join Brother Thomas, the monastery's de facto chef, though no one would dare call him that out loud. He prefers steward of provisions. You prefer not to cross him before breakfast. You begin chopping root vegetables, parsnips, turnips, and something unidentifiable that smells vaguely of wet wood. Meanwhile, Brother Thomas tends to a bubbling cauldron filled with what he cheerfully calls sacred stew. You don't ask. In medieval monasteries, meals followed strict dietary guidelines, especially regarding fasting days. And there were a lot of fasting days. Nearly half the calendar, in fact, required abstaining from meat. But meat was a surprisingly flexible term. According to the rules, Anything from land-based warm-blooded animals counted as forbidden, but if it swam, technically fair game. And if it sort of swam, or was argued to be fish-like, also fine if you squinted. You learn quickly that the monks weren't exactly cheating. They just had an enthusiastic interpretation of taxonomy. Beavers, for example, were on the menu. Because they lived in water and had scaly tails, monks reasoned they were basically fish. Otters, too. Puffins, fish-like enough. Capybaras, not native to Europe, but later included in South American fasts under the same logic. God works in mysterious categories, one monk tells you with a wink. Even barnacle geese were considered fish by some medieval thinkers. Why? Because of a bizarre belief that these geese didn't hatch from eggs, but grew on driftwood and barnacles at sea. No egg, no land birth. Clearly a marine animal. Historians still argue whether these reinterpretations were genuine beliefs or sanctified loopholes. Some abbots were stricter banning such creative fish. Others turned a blind eye as long as the monks chanted an extra psalm and didn't gloat. Today's menu is less exotic. You're helping prepare leeks peas, black bread, and what Brother Thomas calls invisible fish, a broth so weak it smells more like memory than mackerel. You ask if it ever bothers them, all this abstaining and adapting. He shrugs. Discipline feeds the soul. Leeks feed the stomach. You take a break and wander through the cool stone corridor leading to the buttery storage room for, among other things, wine ale and preserved fish. The air here is thick with salt and aged mystery. Barrels are marked with chalk, herring. Ale. Definitely not eel, but actually eel. A novice explains that on special days, feast days, Sundays, not during Lent, meat was allowed. Then the tables transformed. Chickens, rabbits, even the occasional suckling pig might appear. But even then, gluttony was frowned upon. Meals were eaten in silence with readings from Scripture, and portions were regulated. Back in the kitchen, Brother Thomas shows you the feast book, a handmade ledger of special recipes and allowable ingredients by season. There are notes like, use nettles before the frost, stir clockwise during Lent, and do not let Brother Roland near the spice cupboard again. You're handed a basket and sent to the garden. The monastery's herb patch is surprisingly fragrant thyme, sage, parsley, wormwood. You gather handfuls and return to the kitchen, where they're crushed with salt and mixed into a barley paste. As the meal comes together, a bell rings in the distance prime. That gives you just enough time to ladle stew into earthen bowls and line them on the warming shelf. The bread is hard as stone, but meant to be dipped. Lunch is served in the refectory with quiet ceremony. Each monk takes a bowl, bows slightly, and sits. A passage from the Rule of St. Benedict is read aloud, something about humility and not eyeing your neighbor's portion. You're glad for the reminder. Brother Felix's bowl seems suspiciously more full. You eat slowly. The stew is simple, earthy, and strangely satisfying. You taste onion garlic, maybe a hint of fish, real or imagined. The bread softens in the broth, and you realize that eating like this requires patience. You can't rush a spoon made of wood, or maybe you just don't want to. After the meal, you help with cleanup. The monks wash every bowl with meticulous care. Waste is minimal. Even scraps go to the pigs, who live in a pen behind the orchard. They fast too, one monk jokes, until we don't. Not all monasteries were as austere. Wealthier ones had better connections, more farmland, and often more indulgent menus. Some even imported spices and dried fruit. But no matter how grand the pantry meals were never just about sustenance. They were about structure, gratitude, and self-restraint. Later, you visit the ale room, a low-ceilinged cellar where frothy monk-brewed beer rests in casks. You sample a small cup malty herbal, surprisingly rich. Beer was safer than water in many places, and the monks perfected it not just for survival, but for flavor. You ask about dessert. The answer occasionally, usually fruit or a kind of almond paste called marchpane made during feast days. No sugar too expensive. Honey was used instead, gathered by the monastery's own bees. As dusk settles, the kitchen quiets. The fire is banked pots scrubbed and knives sheathed. You sit near the hearth with a cup of warm ale, feeling the ache in your feet and the warmth in your chest. Meals here aren't extravagant, but they're consistent, earned, thoughtful. And tomorrow, maybe there will be puffin. It's a haircut you've seen in every monk painting, a round bald patch, like a celestial spotlight on the scalp. But what did that strange style mean? Was it practical punishment? A spiritual Wi-Fi signal? Get ready to explore the world of tonsures, where hair met holiness and scissors held surprising symbolism. You wake up to the familiar sound of bells echoing through stone. Another dawn, another rhythm. But today, you're taken somewhere new, the tonsorium. It's not a chapel or garden or scriptorium. It's the monastery's tiny barber shop, and sitting in the center is a high wooden stool with a leather strap, worn smooth with use. A jug of water rests nearby, along with a small knife, a pair of shears, and a worn cloth. Brother Aidan gestures for you to sit. Visitor gets the first cut. He signs with a grin. You pause, uncertain, because this isn't just a haircut, it's a rite, a visible vow. Monastic tonsure, the shaving of part or all of the scalp, was a tradition with many meanings. It marked you as a man of the cloth, a servant of God, and not so subtly someone who had given up earthly vanities. But that circle on top style, that wasn't universal. There were three main types of tonsures in the medieval world, each with distinct origins, shapes, and symbolic weight. The Roman tonsure was the most iconic, a circular bald patch on the crown encircled by a ring of hair. The look you probably associate with every cartoon friar ever. The Celtic tonsure, however, went another direction literally. It involved shaving the front of the head from ear to ear like a holy headband. This version sparked fierce ecclesiastical debates, especially between Irish and Roman churches. Whose hairline was holier, historians still argue. The third, less common style was the Eastern tonsure full scalp, shaved clean favored by certain monastic orders further afield. You let Brother Aidan guide you into the ritual, not with blades, but with explanation. He describes how tonsure dates back to the early church, inspired in part by ancient purification rites. Hair was seen as vanity distraction, even a temptation. Removing it signaled surrender, not just to humility, but to uniformity. In the monastery, everyone bowed their head the same way. You watch as a novice gets his first tonsure. He kneels, eyes closed, hands trembling slightly. A senior monk recites a soft prayer as the shears begin their work. With each snip, a little more of the outside world seems to fall away. No mirrors are present, not out of modesty, but irrelevance. Once finished, the novice bows his head, the pale circle on his crown, catching the candlelight. He looks lighter, like he's wearing a halo made of scalp. You learn that tonsures were maintained regularly, usually every 2 weeks, though some stricter orders did it weekly. It wasn't about perfection. It was about intention. Even patchy spots were seen as noble, each stubble ridge, a quiet badge of devotion. In some places, the shape of the tonsure had political weight. The Council of Whitby in 664 AD famously debated the correct haircut among other issues. The Roman tonsure won out, but not without bitter grumbling from Irish monks who thought their version was more ancient and more authentic. Monastic barbers weren't just hair specialists. They also served as medics' tooth pullers and occasionally unofficial therapists. Sitting in the chair wasn't just grooming, it was confession of another kind. Brother Aidan shares stories of how some monks tried to avoid tonsure, claiming headaches or skin rashes. Others wore extra hoods, hoping no one would notice their creeping hairline. It's vanity, he says, with a shrug, but very polite vanity. You notice that even though everyone has the same cut, no two heads are identical. Some tonsures are perfectly round, others a bit squashed. Some are smooth as polished stones, others freckled or scarred. You start to recognize monks not by their robes, but by the tiny details of their tonsures. The symbolism runs deep. The circle shape represents eternity. The bald patch aligns with the crown of thorns. And the act itself is both a sacrifice and a branding, a monk's visible break from worldly life. You're offered a mock tonsure, just a dab of oil on your crown, and a whispered blessing. It's gentle, but surprisingly moving. You feel marked, not as a monk, but as someone who's glimpsed what it means to surrender ego for rhythm ritual and shared purpose. Later, you visit the laundry, where robes hang like sleepy ghosts. Each one bears a small patch at the collar, where the hood rubs bald heads. You run your fingers over the threadbare fabric, thinking how even cloth adapts to devotion. Before supper, you pass the tonsorium again. Empty now. Just a stool, a mirrorless wall, and the faint scent of lavender and oil. And maybe somewhere in the air, a whisper of quiet pride from generations of shorn heads who bowed before the blade, not in fear, but in faith. Not all monastic miracles happened in the chapel. What if the true heart of the monastery was a garden? A place where onions had sacred roles, cabbages stood guard like sentinels, and each row of herbs healed both body and soul. Grab your wooden rake. It's time to dig into holy soil. You step into the cloister garden just after lauds, while dew still clings to the cabbage leaves like tiny jewels. Morning mist hangs low, curling through lavender and fennel, and a pair of bees buzz lazily over a patch of chive flowers. It's so quiet, you can hear the worms, rustling probably. This garden isn't just a food source. It's a medicine chest, a spiritual retreat, a status symbol, a sanctuary for small talk and even smaller miracles. Brother Walrick the gardener wears a robe so patched it could double as a quilt. His hands are stained with soil that refuses to leave no matter how many times he washes for supper. He hands you a wicker basket and says, "Only pull the weeds, that gossip." You're not sure if he's joking. Medieval monastic gardens were marvels of both science and superstition, divided carefully into sections, culinary, medicinal, and symbolic. Each bed served a distinct purpose. The culinary beds grow your staples, leeks, onions, garlic peas, beans, and kale so tough it could double as armor. You help gather a morning harvest of lettuce and radishes, brushing off the occasional startled beetle. Then there's the medicinal quadrant. Here you're introduced to the monastery's herbal pharmacy. No glass bottles or shiny pills, just leaves roots and the occasional fermented surprise. Valerian for sleep, horehound for coughs, rue for nightmares, wormwood for intestinal woes, and comfrey, beloved by monks for mending broken bones and occasionally misused by overzealous herbalists convinced it could mend broken hearts. Brother Walrick walks you through each plant like a museum guide with dirt under his fingernails. He tells you that sage planted near onions keeps them humble, and that basil must never be spoken to harshly. Herbs have feelings, he insists. You believe him. The central path of the garden forms a perfect cross, bordered with low box hedges. Roses bloom at each corner, not for beauty, but to honor the Virgin Mary. Every plant here is chosen with intent, from the marigolds that keep pests away to the violets that are meant to comfort the grieving. Historians still argue whether these gardens were mostly symbolic or practical, but in truth, they were both. Every shovel of soil carried meaning. Every blossom was a sermon waiting to bloom. Near the south wall, you find a quiet corner of apple trees and soft moss. It's called the listening place. No one speaks here, but monks come to think, pray, and sometimes nap with plausible deniability. You sit beneath one gnarled tree and watch ants parade along the roots like tiny pilgrims. The garden is never idle. Even in winter, monks tend the soil prune branches and plan for spring. Some grow indoor herbs on windowsills. Others preserve autumn's bounty in salted barrels. Gardening is prayer repetition humility. Weeding is confession with dirt under your nails. You spend the afternoon in the compost heap. Glamorous, no, but revealing. Nothing is wasted here. Scraps, peelings, old hay, even ashes from the hearth are layered and turned. The monks call it the slow alchemy where decay becomes life. It's oddly comforting, this transformation proof that even waste has purpose. As you rake leaves into neat piles, Brother Walrick tells you about garden calendars scratched into the cloister walls. Carvings show when to plant, when to harvest, when to leave the soil to rest. The cycles are trusted more than any parchment chart. The earth knows, he says we just try to listen. At one point, a novice arrives in a panic. The beehive has tipped in the wind. You follow the group to the orchard's edge, where a swarm buzzes like a holy alarm. The monks move slowly, deliberately. They speak to the bees, literally thanking them for their labor, gently lifting the hive back into place. You ask if they always talk to bees. Brother Walrick nods. Of course, they're part of the choir. By sunset, the garden glows gold. The scent of rosemary clings to your sleeves. Your knees ache. There's dirt in your hair, but you feel lighter, grounded, like you've tapped into a quiet current older than the monastery itself. You place your harvest basket on the kitchen steps, where a cook will turn these vegetables into something humble and holy. And tomorrow, you'll come back to this soil. Because here, beneath the spire's shadow, in the heartbeat hush, between prayer's cabbages are blooming. Calendula sways, and miracles root themselves softly in rows. Brewing beer behind cloister walls might sound sinful, or at least suspiciously fun. But what if monks were actually medieval master brewers using hops and hymns? In equal measure, could fermentation be a path to holiness? Tonight we descend into the barley-scented shadows of monastic brewing, where silence met suds. You begin in a low stone cellar torchlight, flickering against barrels as wide as oxen. The air is thick with yeast-damp oak and something vaguely nutty. Brother Ulrich, the brewer, is already at work, stirring a copper kettle with the focus of a man sculpting salvation out of froth. He motions for you to approach, and you do cautiously. The brewing process, you'll soon learn, is equal parts chemistry timing and very, very clean hands. Contrary to modern stereotypes, Monks weren't sneaking sips for sport. Beer served a vital role in monastic life. Water was often unsafe, especially in cities, but beer, properly brewed and boiled, was sterile nourishing and surprisingly customizable. Today's batch is small beer, a low alcohol brew meant for daily consumption. Think of it as the Gatorade of its time, hydrating, calorie rich, and safe to drink in generous gulps. Stronger brews were reserved for feast days celebrations or very lucky visitors. Brother Ulrich tosses in a bundle of dried herbs, hops mostly, but also a few secret ingredients he won't name. For balance, he says with a wink, you suspect the real recipe is passed down like a sacred relic. Medieval monks didn't just make beer, they innovated it. They improved consistency, developed early filtration methods, and pioneered fermentation timing. Their monasteries had temperature-controlled cellars long before anyone else understood the concept. Some even grew their own hops and barley in carefully rotated fields. You help stir the mashed tun, watching the grains swirl and thicken. The scent is rich, comforting. Like warm bread and firewood had a quiet conversation. The brewing process takes days, even weeks. But today, you witness the key phases: mashing, boiling, and the all-important cooling and pitching, where yeast is added. That last step must be done just right, too hot, and the yeast dies too cold, and the fermentation stalls. It's a Goldilocks moment in monastic science. Historians still argue whether monastic beer was genuinely superior or just the most carefully recorded. What's certain is that their brews were safer and more consistent than what many townsfolk could get from local taverns. You peek into a barrel room lined with kegs, labeled in Chalk Feast Brew, Pilgrim Ale, emergency use only. That last one contains an extra strong batch only tapped when visitors fall ill, monks grow faint, or winter grows too long. Outside the brewery, you see monks delivering jugs of ale to the infirmary. Beer wasn't just for thirst, it was medicine. Herbal brews, infused with yarrow thyme or rosemary, were used to treat everything from fever to melancholy. And yes, sometimes even monastic sluggishness, which Brother Ulrich describes as the inability to chant without yawning. As evening falls, the brewery hosts its weekly taste and prayer gathering. It's not a party, no music, no dancing, just a moment to bless the week's work and sample a small cup in gratitude. You sip slowly the beer, dark and smooth with hints of honey and smoke. The monks close their eyes as they drink, not in ecstasy, but reverence. This isn't about indulgence. It's about presence. Later, Brother Ulrich shows you a dusty scroll tucked behind a vat. It's an old brewing log filled with notes like barley too coarse, Brother Anselm's fault, or try dried figs next Lent. The handwriting changes over the centuries, but the voice remains familiar. Humble, curious, joyful. You help clean the tools, scrubbing sticky ladles and rinsing mashcloths. It's messy work, but like everything here, even the cleanup has rhythm. A kind of monastic choreography. Before bed, you pass the brewing room again. It's quiet now. Just the slow drip of condensation and the soft hiss of fermentation, like the monastery itself is breathing. And maybe it is, because here, in this damp corner of sacred space, monks have turned grains into comfort yeast, into medicine, and a humble pint into a prayer with a frothy head. A weary traveler knocks at a monastery gate. What happens next? A sermon, a sandwich, or maybe a foot bath and a story. What were the secret customs behind monastic hospitality, and how did guests fit into this silent world? Tonight you're invited in guest book, not required. You're standing outside the monastery's main gate, not as a monk this time, but as a stranger, a pilgrim. someone with sore feet and hopeful eyes. The large wooden door creaks open just enough for a voice to ask softly, Pax vobiscum, peace be with you. You nod, and with that, you're welcomed. Hospitality wasn't just encouraged in medieval monasteries, it was required. Rule 53 of the Rule of St. Benedict states it clearly, let all guests who arrive be received like Christ. That wasn't metaphorical. Every guest, noble or peasant, dirty or perfumed, was to be treated with dignity. You're led into a guest hall called the hospitium, separate from the main cloister, but no less clean or quiet. A monk hands you a towel, a small loaf of bread, and a basin of warm water. No questions, no judgment, just kindness in linen robes. The monastery's guest master today, it's Brother Cyprian, explains that each guest may stay up to 3 days without obligation. Meals will be provided. A bed will be made. And if you're truly in need, you may request confession counsel or simply a place to sit in silence. You ask if many travelers come through. Brother Cyprian nods. Pilgrims en route to Rome, peasants between markets, scribes hunting for rare manuscripts, even the occasional nobleman seeking penance for a particularly embarrassing duel. Some guests stay a single night, leaving at dawn with blistered feet and blessed bread in hand. Others linger for days, hoping the silence will speak louder than their worries. You're shown to the guest refectory, separate from the monk's own dining room. The same food, just fewer reading rules. A novice sets down a bowl of lentil stew and a piece of black bread. It's not fancy, but it's warm, and the spoon is clean. Historians still debate how uniformly monasteries upheld this level of hospitality. Some were famously generous, others less so, especially if guests overstayed their welcome or got a little too chatty at matins. But in general, monasteries were known as safe havens in a chaotic world. You meet a fellow guest, a woman disguised as a man traveling toward Santiago. She nods at you over her bowl and murmurs, "The monks didn't ask, so I didn't tell." Her voice carries the weariness of dust-covered roads and the relief of hot soup. Brother Cyprian shows you the guest chapel, smaller and simpler than the main one. Here, outsiders can pray without disrupting the monastic rhythm. The candles flicker with the sighs of travelers who've come and gone before you. Outside the chapel is a small foot-washing bench with warm water always at the ready. A monk gently takes your feet and begins to clean them. It's awkward at first, intimate, humbling. But he says nothing, just hums a soft tune, something halfway between a lullaby and a psalm. At night, you're given a small cell in the guest house complete with straw mattress, woolen blanket, and a beeswax candle stub. There's a carving above the door. Be still and know. You don't know what it means exactly, but the stillness comes easily. Over the next day, you witness more of this quiet welcome. A ragged boy arrives with his mother. They're given bread, clean cloths, and a seat by the fire. A tinker asks for shelter from the rain. He leaves the next morning with a patched boot and a wink. No payment is taken. Only prayers offered. Monks don't hover. They give space. But somehow, you're never alone. Someone always notices when your cup is empty, or when your eyes linger too long on a crack in the wall. You discover the guest book, a thick ledger filled with names, prayers, drawings, and occasional confessions. Some entries are tear-stained. Others are written in shaky Latin. One simply says, "Thank you. I remembered how to breathe here." It's not all solemnity. One evening, a group of traveling minstrels is granted entry. They stay one night in exchange for a quiet courtyard performance. No lutes too festive, but soft voices singing a ballad about St. Cuthbert's donkey. The monks chuckle, even if they don't clap. You ask Brother Cyprian why hospitality matters so much. He points to a worn inscription near the doorway. Angels have walked among us as strangers. That night, the wind howls, but you're warm. Your bed is lumpy. Your blanket is thin, but you feel protected by kindness, by order, and by the shared human contract that says you're welcome here, just as you are. In the morning, you leave through the same wooden gate now, understanding what it meant to arrive. And back inside the guest bed is already being made, waiting for the next soul who needs a place to rest. A library where books are chained, a reading room with no chairs, just kneeling mats. What kind of knowledge was worth locking down, and who got to read it? Step quietly into the monastic library, where sacred words were protected not by passwords, but by iron ritual and reverent silence. You push open a heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning like old knees. Inside is a space unlike any other in the monastery. Narrow windows, arched ceilings, and rows upon rows of shelves. But the shelves are different. Each holds not loose books, but volumes literally chained to metal rods. This is the chained library, the monastery's most precious vault, not for gold or relics, but for knowledge. At first glance, it feels restrictive. But look closer. The chains are long enough to allow reading at a desk, but short enough to prevent theft. In a world where books took months or years to copy by hand, each volume was more valuable than livestock, sometimes even more than land. You walk slowly along the aisle, trailing your fingers gently across leather bindings. The smell of old parchment and beeswax wraps around you like a woolen shawl. Each book has a metal fitting, a hand-lettered tag, and a worn spine. No dust monks clean these daily, like altarpieces. Brother Severin the librarian greets you with a nod and a whisper. If you breathe too hard, the books sigh. You laugh softly, then stop unsure if he's joking. The rules here are clear: books may not leave the room. Readers must sit at designated benches, some equipped with angled desks, others with padded knee rests. Quills and ink pots are allowed, but only under supervision. And hands must be clean, sleeves rolled back, no exception. You sit at one bench, where a massive psalter lies open. The pages are thick, slightly curled at the edges. You turn one slowly, and find not just script, but illumination, a glowing letter D shaped like a dragon curling around a saint. It's breathtaking. Historians still argue about how widespread these chained libraries were. Some existed only in the largest abbeys, while others were simple closets with locks. But the idea was the same: protect the sacred text from time fire and forgetfulness. Brother Severin shows you the library catalog, written entirely by hand and updated with each new acquisition. It includes not only religious texts, but histories, herbal manuals, astronomical charts, and even a few philosophical works considered safe enough. Dangerous books were locked in a separate cabinet. You're not allowed to look. Naturally, you're now dying to. You spot a book labeled Physica Hildegardi, a collection of herbal and medicinal knowledge by Hildegard of Bingen. You're surprised. A woman's work, you ask. Brother Severin nods. Wisdom doesn't always wear a beard. There's a rhythm to this space. Quills, scratching pages, turning a bell every hour to remind you to stretch or pray. No one speaks unless absolutely necessary. Even coughing earns a gentle glare from the older monks. This is not a place for noise. It's a sanctuary for stillness of the mind. You notice that some books have small wax seals inside the covers. These mark them as blessed, not just physically valuable, but spiritually potent. To copy one incorrectly was considered a serious sin. You're told of a monk who added a single line to a sermon and was forced to rewrite the entire book as penance. Before lunch, you help dust the shelves. A soft brush is used not to clean the pages, but to ward off tiny beetles that love parchment glue. Bookworms, quite literally. One monk whispers, "They only eat the dull parts." Later, Brother Severin allows you to assist in a simple repair, reattaching a loosened binding on a copy of Boethius. The tools are primitive but effective linen thread, bone folder, beeswax. No glue guns, no tape. Every stitch is a prayer, every crease a memory. You're led to a smaller annex at the back, the scriptorium overflow, where unfinished manuscripts rest like patients waiting for surgery. Some are blank, others half-written. One has a marginal note that reads, "I'm so tired I could illuminate with my eyes closed." You feel that deeply. There's a growing awareness in you, a quiet awe at the labor that goes into preserving thought. Each book here is a conversation between generations, not just monk to monk, but soul to soul across centuries. At Vespers, you return your borrowed psalter to its place and wrap the chain gently around its rod. You whisper, "Thank you, though." You're not sure if it's to the book or the scribe who copied it. As you step back into the cloister, the wind rustles your sleeve, and you imagine the books behind you exhaling. Because in this library, knowledge doesn't shout. It waits and listens. Monks, in wool year-round, scratchy robes and no shoelaces. Why such a limited wardrobe, and what secret messages were sewn into the seams? Could clothing reveal status vows, even hidden rebellion? Step into the laundry room where every stitch stain and fold tells a tale of devotion and the occasional itch. You're handed a bundle before breakfast, not food, but cloth. A rough, oatmeal-colored robe that smells faintly of lavender and damp stone. It's not your first time wearing one, but now you're here to learn what it actually means. Monastic fashion is on the surface about simplicity, but like everything in the cloister, it hides layers. Brother Rollo, keeper of the laundry and unofficial tailor, greets you with a wink. Robes talk, he says, if you know how to listen. The first rule, wool. Always wool. Summer, winter doesn't matter. Linen was considered too fine, too worldly. Wool, with its stubborn weight and relentless scratch, reminded monks of their vows, especially poverty and discipline. You slip on the robe. It's heavy. The sleeves are wide, the hood deep. There are no buttons, just a corded belt tied in a knot that varies by order. You ask why, and Brother Rollo replies, because simplicity still needs structure. Each monastic order had its own signature style. Benedictines wore black habits, a symbol of humility and death to the world. Cistercians preferred undyed white wool, closer to beige to reflect purity and simplicity. Franciscans, gray or brown, tied with a rope that sometimes bore 3 knots, one each, for poverty, chastity, and obedience. Historians still argue how strict these dress codes were. Some abbeys enforced every hem and hood angle. Others were more relaxed, especially in colder climates, where layering with fur quietly became necessary. One monk even stitched rabbit fur into his robe collar and claimed it was a theological experiment in comfort. You're brought to the laundry room, a stone chamber warmed by coals and filled with steaming basins. Robes hang like ghosts from wooden racks, dripping quietly. Brother Rollo shows you how to scrub with soap made of ash and fat rinse in cold water, then beat the cloth with wooden paddles. To humble the fabric, he jokes. Laundry wasn't just domestic work, it was spiritual discipline. Monks believed in cleanliness, not for vanity, but for health and dignity. Dirty robes were allowed during fasts or acts of penance, but otherwise tidiness was a virtue. As you hang a robe to dry, you notice tiny stitches at the hem initials. Monks didn't claim ownership, but laundry still needed a sorting system. Each brother had a unique mark sewn into his robe, usually near the ankle or inner collar. Some monks personalized in secret. One robe has a barely visible embroidery of a lily symbol of purity. Another bears a stitched snail, an inside joke perhaps. Brother Rollo shrugs. Even vows leave wiggle room. He tells you about cloak privileges. Certain monks were allowed extra garments for travel, cold nights, or special roles. The guest master wore a slightly longer robe. The librarian had deeper sleeves to carry scrolls, and abbots. Sometimes they indulged in finer thread or richer dye, not gaudy, but noticeable. You ask about shoes. Monks didn't wear fancy footwear, usually sandals or soft leather slippers, sometimes even barefoot inside the cloister. In winter, woolen socks were common, sometimes wrapped in scrap cloth or layered for warmth, but laces too fussy. Simplicity again. Brother Rollo leads you to the sewing bench, where novices patch robes with waxed thread. You try at clumsy fingers, crooked stitches, but no one laughs. Repairing robes is a communal task. Frayed edges, torn sleeves, signs of labor, not failure. There's a robe drying near the hearth, deeply worn, nearly translucent in spots. Brother Rollo says it belonged to a monk who never asked for a replacement even after 20 winters. He said his prayers warmed him enough. You pause. That level of austerity feels unreachable, but the point you realize isn't to match it. It's to understand the commitment stitched into the fabric. Midday, a bell calls you to robe inspection. Monks line up in the cloister walk as the prior glances over each garment, not critically, but carefully. He checks for phrase mud stains, signs of neglect or excess. A monk with 2 polished sandals is gently told to walk through more puddles. You return to the laundry to help fold. Robes are folded carefully, hoods tucked, sleeves pressed flat. Each is placed in a cedar chest, lined with rosemary to deter moths, and perhaps add a touch of calm. Later you sit with Brother Rollo by the fire. He pulls out a robe, once worn by a long-dead monk, known for his kindness. We keep it, he says, not as a relic, but a reminder. You run your hand over the soft wool, worn nearly threadbare at the knees from years of prayer. Historians often overlook the significance of monastic clothing, seeing it as uniform forgettable. But here you see otherwise. Every fold holds memory. Every patch has a reason. Even the plainest robe carries stories of work of worship, of whispered winter jokes told over steaming buckets. As you slip out of your borrowed robe for the night, you fold it, carefully hood-tucked belt wrapped once around. Because in this monastery, even the laundry is a kind of liturgy. Have you ever wondered what prayer sounds like when it never stops? What if chanting wasn't just ritual, but a way to measure time, unify hearts, and lull even the restless into stillness? Tonight, you'll slip into the sacred rhythm of monastic singing, where breath, melody, and devotion become one seamless whisper. You're sitting in the chapel again, but this time it's not the architecture that holds your attention, it's the sound. A single voice rises first, clear, pure, unaccompanied. Then another joins, then another, until the air itself seems to tremble under the weight of unity. This is Gregorian chant, the lifeblood of the monastery's daily cycle. It doesn't feel like music, not in the way you think of it. There's no beat, no instruments, no crescendo, just tone flow and gentle rise and fall. You listen closely and realize the chant isn't performed, it's lived. It emerges from silence and returns to it like a breath drawn and released. The daily chant cycle aligns with the divine office, the 8 set hours of monastic prayer: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun vespers, and compline. Each has its own flavor of chant. Some are brief and focused, others long and hypnotic. You've already heard many of them, but now you're here to understand them. Brother Galen, the cantor, explains in a whisper that monks don't chant for performance. It's not to impress. It's to align. Align what you ask. Us, he says, with time with heaven with each other. Chanting began in the early centuries of Christianity, drawing on Jewish psalmody and Roman musical forms. But by the time of Charlemagne, it had become standardized across much of Western Europe. Named after Pope Gregory, though he may not have actually invented it, Gregorian chant became the heartbeat of monastic prayer. You sit in the back row, where a novice hands you a chant book, a hand-copied volume filled with square neumes, medieval musical notes on red staves. There are no bar lines, no key signatures. You don't read music, but you can still follow the rise and fall like walking a mountain trail drawn in ink. Brother Galen shows you how to breathe not through the chest, but the belly. Chant requires breath control posture, and above all, calm. You try humming a line. It comes out shaky like a confused bee. He smiles. That's how we all start. The monks chant in unison, which is not the same as singing together. It means they all sing one melody, no harmony, no solo flourishes. The unity is part of the prayer. Your voice disappears into the collective, like a drop into a still pond. Chanting isn't constant, but it feels like it is. The hours of prayer create a framework, a rhythm that structures the day. You begin to notice how silence becomes music's canvas, how the pause before a note is just as sacred as the note itself. Historians still debate whether chant had measurable effects on monk morale or mental health, but anecdotal evidence suggests it calmed anxiety, eased insomnia, and helped cement memory. After all, psalms chanted daily become part of the body. Brother Galen leads you through a compline service. The chapel is dark except for a single lantern near the altar. The chants tonight are slow and low, designed to soothe rather than stir. You feel your shoulders drop, your mind slow. You don't understand the Latin, but somehow you do. Not all chants are somber. Some midday hymns are surprisingly cheerful, even lilting. On feast days, the monks chant with extra gusto, slightly faster tempo, fuller sound. But even then, the mood remains measured. No applause, no encore, just a shared exhale. You ask if monks ever grow tired of chanting the same texts every day. Brother Galen shakes his head. A river doesn't tire of flowing. It just finds new paths. In the music room, you find relics of chant past wax tablets for early notation practice, cracked tuning pipes, even a broken hurdy-gurdy from a century when instruments were briefly tolerated. There's also a shelf of parchment scrolls labeled out of tune in Latin. You ask if those chants were banned. No Galen smirks, just less beloved. As evening descends, you attend Vespers. Tonight's chant includes a solo line, a brief moment where one monk chants a phrase before the rest join in. It's not meant to stand out. It's meant to draw others in. That's the essence of chant. Not individual brilliance, but communal breath. A shared offering that requires no applause, just presence. After the service, you walk the cloister walk in silence. The chant still echoes faintly in your mind. It's not stuck like a pop song. It lingers more like incense, subtle, warm, sacred. And when you lie down in your cell, the rhythm follows you. Maybe prayer isn't always words. Maybe sometimes it's just a note that never quite ends. What if your job title included beekeeper bookbinder, gravedigger, and candle counter? What if your whole life fit into a single cloister, but your duties changed with every sunrise? Tonight, we follow the odd jobs of monks, tasks that reveal how the sacred was stitched into every chore into worship. The bell rings after prime, and instead of heading to the chapel, you're pulled aside by Brother Adalbert, who hands you a broom, a basket, and a smile that says, "Today's going to be unusual." You've been assigned to the rota, a rotating set of daily monastery duties. It's part of the rhythm, the balance between aura prayer and labora work. While the outside world might separate jobs into titles and roles here, every monk does everything at some point. And today, you're tagging along. Your first stop is the apiary. It's tucked behind the herb garden, where rows of wooden hives line up like miniature chapels. Brother Anselm dons a simple veil, lifts a lid, and hums, not at the bees, but with them. They like tone, he says. It keeps them calm. The bees are surprisingly well behaved. You help check honey levels, clean wax combs, and gently brush a few stragglers back inside. Honey here isn't just sweetener, it's medicine preservative and sacred gift. On feast days, a spoonful might grace the bread. On sick days, it might soothe a monk's throat before chant. Next, you're off to the scriptorium, not to copy, but to sweep. Even sacred spaces need dusting. You watch scribes work while you swish your broom quietly. One monk sneezes into his sleeve, then sighs. St. Jerome never had allergies, he mutters. From there, it's the burial garden, where you help rake gravel paths and tidy small wooden markers. Death is not feared here, only forgottenness. Each grave bears a simple cross, no names. Brother Adalbert explains, "We return to God nameless. Humility follows us underground. You notice one grave with fresh flowers. A silent nod from the brother beside you says everything. After lunch, your rota shifts again. Now you're assisting Brother Otmar in the bookbindery, where worn pages are sewn back into shape. You learn to mix paste from flour and water, how to align parchment without wrinkling, and how to press books between heavy oak boards. Otmar jokes that glue is the only thing stronger than doctrine. Next up, the candle cellar. It's darker than you'd expect, lit by a few flickering tallow stubs. Beeswax candles are measured, trimmed, counted. You're handed a knife to scrape wax strips off old holders. The scent is faintly sweet, the kind of smell that clings to thoughts more than clothes. Not every job is this charming. You end the afternoon in the latrine trench, helping a monk with the unfortunate title of necessity warden. He makes jokes, many jokes. You laugh more than you should given the smell. But even here, there's dignity. Cleanliness is kindness. Maintenance is mercy. Historians still argue how much manual labor monks really did. Some abbeys hired lay brothers for the heavy lifting. But in smaller or stricter houses, the rota kept everyone grounded. No task too low, no monk too lofty. You return briefly to the kitchen to fetch more soap. On the way, you see monks tending to everything from sick animals to wounded fingers. One brother is mending a sandal strap. Another is gathering feathers to refill a cushion. No job gets a sermon, but all of them feel like prayers. The final task of your day is the lantern check. As the sun dips, you and Brother Adalbert light tapers and walk through the halls, ensuring every sconce has enough wax to last through the night. Shadows dance along the stone, flickering gently as if bowing to your steps. At one corner, a mouse scurries by. Adalbert nods toward it. Brother Mouse is on cheese patrol. You decide not to ask how often he succeeds. You finish in the chapel, placing one last candle on the altar. Your back aches. Your hands are smudged. But something in you feels settled. Every job today, however mundane, had a purpose, a rhythm, a grace. And tomorrow, someone else will sweep. Someone else will count candles. But tonight, you'll sleep, knowing you helped keep the light burning. Bones wrapped in silk, teeth kissed through glass. What if your nightly prayers were whispered beside the pinky finger of a long-dead saint? Dive into the peculiar world of relics, where faith and fragments meet, and where even the toe of a martyr might cure a toothache or a troubled soul. It's just after none when Brother Pascal beckons you toward a quiet hallway off the main chapel, a place few visitors go. The corridor is lined with niches, each housing a reliquary, ornate containers, some golden, others simple wood, all hiding fragments of the divine. At first you're hesitant. It feels strange, maybe even macabre, to spend time among bones and bits. But as you step closer, the air seems to shift. Not colder, but weightier, like the space itself is remembering. You pause before one reliquary shaped like a miniature cathedral. Inside, behind a sheet of crystal, rests what appears to be a knuckle-brownish, curled slightly, and crowned with a tiny gold ring. Saint Verena whispers, Brother Pascal, patron of laundry and nervous hands. You blink. He nods. Very popular during laundry season. Relics were, and still are, a cornerstone of monastic devotion. These weren't just souvenirs. They were considered living links to the saints' physical reminders of holy lives and heavenly intercession. First-class relics included actual body parts. Second-class items the saint used or touched. Third-class, anything that had touched a first or second-class relic. In other words, holy by proximity. You move slowly through the collection. A femur of a martyr. A fragment of cloth from St. Hildegard's veil. A cracked vial said to contain dried tears from St. Bernard, though even Brother Pascal admits that one's more hopeful than confirmed. The reliquaries themselves are works of art. Gold filigree, enamel saints, tiny silver hinges that squeak when opened. One is shaped like a hand palm upward with a shard of finger bone encased in its hollow wrist. Another is a glass orb suspended by chains inside which rests a single tooth on velvet. For jaw afflictions, Brother Pascal notes, you ask if the monks actually believe in their power. He smiles. Belief is layered. The relics don't work like spells. They invite you to hope. Historians still argue about relic authenticity. For every well-documented fragment, there were dozens more of questionable origin. Medieval Europe was practically overrun with saints' kneecaps, Jesus' baby teeth, and feathers from the Archangel Gabriel. But even dubious relics offered real comfort. Pilgrims came from miles around to see Kiss or simply kneel before relics. Stories abound of miraculous cures, sudden visions, and emotional conversions. Were they real, perhaps? But more importantly, they were believed. You're shown the monastery's most prized relic, a piece of the true cross, kept in a small cross-shaped case under 3 locks. Only the abbot prior and guest master hold keys. It's brought out only on high feast days, when incense fills the chapel and everyone gathers in silent awe. But not all relics are grand. Some are quirky. One monk keeps a scrap of Saint Zita's apron near the kitchen. Another swears that a shard of Saint Blaise's comb cured his beard rash. Faith takes many forms. Some smell like beeswax. Brother Pascal admits that relics can attract the odd enthusiast. One traveling noble once tried to trade a horse for a finger bone. Another tried to smuggle one out sewn into a hat. We had to frisk the donkey, he mutters. As evening draws near, you help prepare the chapel for Compline. A small reliquary is placed near the altar, a sliver of Saint Scholastica's rib housed in a silver lily. Tonight's hymn will reference her wisdom, her silence, her sleepless devotion. You kneel beside it, unsure what to feel. But then you notice something. The silence is deeper here, not heavier, just more anchored, as if centuries of whispered prayers have settled into the stone itself. Relics are odd. They blur the line between presence and absence, between sacred and strange. But in this quiet place, surrounded by monks who've built their lives on rhythms and rituals, they somehow make sense. Before bed, you pass the reliquary room once more. You pause before the glass-toothed orb, now dim in the candlelight. You lean close, not to kiss it, just to say thank you. And for a moment, the weight of the day of the world feels a little lighter. What if the greatest luxury of monastic life wasn't gold visions or miracles, but quiet repetition? As the stars blink above the cloister, one last time, you'll follow the rhythms of a life that never needed noise to be full. Let's settle into the hush before sunrise, where stillness becomes a kind of sanctuary. It's the last night of your stay. You wake just before matins, not to bells or footsteps, but to silence so complete it seems alive. The sky outside your small window is inky blue, that particular shade of almost morning that only monks and moths are truly familiar with. You rise slowly, the floor cool beneath your feet, the woolen robe familiar now in weight and scent. You know the way to the chapel by heart, your steps instinctively avoiding the one loose stone in the corridor that always squeaks. The cloister is quiet, but not asleep. You hear the soft rustle of robes, the distant clearing of a throat, a candle being relit. It's a shared ritual, unspoken and unhurried. Everyone here knows this rhythm, not because they were told, but because they've lived it. In the chapel, the lanterns are low. Shadows stretch long across the flagstones, and the smell of incense lingers like a memory. You take your seat among the others. No one looks at you, not out of rudeness, but reverence. This hour is for stillness. Matins begins with chant, as always. But this time, you notice how your own breathing falls into sync with the melody. You don't know the words, but you don't need to. You're part of the echo now. After prayers, you step outside into the pre-dawn courtyard. The sky has begun to blush at the edges. A bird sings just one, and in that moment it feels like a psalm. The monks disperse quietly, each returning to their duties. You follow Brother Thomas to the kitchen where you help stoke the fire. The motions are familiar now, stirring, kneading, wiping flour from your robe. Even the bread dough feels like an old friend. Later in the garden, you help Brother Walrick turn compost. The smell is strong, the work messy, but there's grace in the labor. You see how yesterday's waste becomes tomorrow's soil. The cycle continues, always. In the library, you pass a monk asleep over a half-copied page. You gently nudge his quill away before the ink stains the margin. Outside, another monk is humming not a chant this time, just a tune. Maybe something his mother sang before he ever found these walls. As the sun climbs, you join a short procession to the guest house gate. A traveler is leaving. He bows, receives a blessing, and disappears down the road. The monks don't watch long. The road is not their concern. The cloister is. You return to your cell briefly to rest. It's bare but familiar now. The blanket smells like herbs and wax. You lie back and listen to the silence. It's not empty. It's full of prayers, footsteps turning pages, the buzzing of bees, and the rustle of robes on stone. Historians still debate whether monks were happy. The rule demanded discipline, renunciation, and strict obedience. But it also promised balance, order, peace. And within that structure, many found something modern. Life often forgets to offer enoughness. No ambition, no performance, just presence. You've come to see how each moment here is shaped by quiet devotion. Not dramatic miracles, but small sacred acts, setting a candle straight, folding a robe, neatly watering the time. The greatest luxury in this place isn't possession, but purpose. As sunset nears, you help prepare the chapel for Compline, the final prayer of the day. The air smells of lavender and melted wax. You light a small taper and place it in the holder beside your seat. It flickers gently. It waits. The chant is slower tonight, each note drawn out like breath. No rush, no crescendo, just a final exhale. You kneel with the others. The silence after the final amen feels like the closing of a book, not an ending. A resting. The sky outside the cloister glows dim gold, the last of the sun, slipping behind old stone and blooming lavender. You sit alone now, in the garden, where bees once danced, and secrets once rooted beneath time and rose. The chapel bell won't ring again tonight. The voices have faded. The candles gutter low. All that remains is the rhythm, the soft exhale of wind through herbs, the creak of wood in restful beams, and the echo of distant footsteps, gently swallowed by ancient halls. You close your eyes. The weight of wool on your shoulders has become familiar. The scent of beeswax and bread clings to your sleeve. And the silence so intimidating before is now a companion. Not hollow, not cold, but kind. Here in this small patch of tended earth and whispered prayer, you understand something simple. A quiet life is not an empty one. It is full of folded robes, thumb-worn psalms, warm bowls of barley, and sleepy jokes whispered over honey. And as the stars blink into view, you feel no rush, no need, no goal, just stillness. A breath drawn, a candle's final flicker, and the slow, soft whisper of a soul at rest.